Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where we take a quiet look at unusual questions from history, science, and the many corners of the past that still leave people wondering. Tonight, we are looking at a claim that has grown across old photographs, forgotten newspaper reports, oversized buildings, antique furniture, and maps bearing names that no longer appear in the same way. It is the idea that unusually tall humans once lived openly among ordinary populations, not merely as isolated performers or medical curiosities, but as members of a recognized social group connected, in some versions of the theory, to the vast region once labelled Tartary or Tartaria. The claim is not a small one. It suggests that some large public buildings may have been designed for bodies much taller than ours, that certain enormous tools were made for hands stronger and larger than those of the average person, and that 19th century photographs may preserve images of individuals whose size has been explained away too quickly. It also proposes that reports of giant skeletons, once common in newspapers, gradually disappeared from public discussion as museums and academic institutions adopted stricter systems of classification. That does not mean every part of the claim is true. Old photographs can mislead us. Camera angles distort height. Newspapers have always published exaggerations. Buildings are often made large to create a sense of power, ceremony, or importance. Unusual furniture may have symbolic or decorative purposes. The word Tartary itself was used by European mapmakers for a broad collection of regions and peoples rather than a single hidden world empire. Still, the theory continues to attract attention because its supporters do not point to only one object or one image. They point to a pattern. They place the photographs beside the doors beside the furniture beside the tools, and the tools beside old reports of human remains. Then they ask whether the standard explanations account for the entire collection, or only for each item separately. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Are there old buildings near you with doors that seem far too tall, windows placed strangely high, or staircases broad enough for someone much larger than the people using them now? Perhaps you have walked through a railway station, courthouse, palace, museum, or government office, and wondered why every entrance seems designed to make an ordinary person feel small. You may also have seen one of the photographs passed around online. A very tall man stands beside soldiers, workers, or officials. A woman appears to rise above everyone in a crowded street. A group poses beside an enormous chair. The caption claims that this is proof of a forgotten population. The comments below usually divide immediately. Some people see a clear record of hidden history. Others see forced perspective, theatrical promotion, or a tall person photographed beside shorter companions. As we move through this subject, it helps to keep both possibilities in view. Curiosity is useful, but so is caution. A mystery becomes more interesting, not less, when we separate what can be observed from what has been added later. If you enjoy these slow investigations into unusual history, you can give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps other curious listeners find this small corner of the internet, where we can examine strange claims without shouting at one another, which is already a considerable achievement. Settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin with the basic question behind the entire theory. Were there once people of exceptional height who occupied recognized positions within older societies, and could traces of their presence still remain in the objects, buildings, and records left behind? Human height has always varied. Even today, some individuals grow well beyond the average because of genetics, nutrition, hormonal conditions, or a combination of factors. Documented people have reached heights above 8 feet. A few have approached 9 feet. Such individuals are rare, but they are real, and their existence does not require a lost civilization. This is where the theory first becomes difficult to evaluate. A photograph of one extremely tall person proves only that one extremely tall person existed. It does not prove the presence of an organized class of giant administrators, guards, builders, or rulers. To support that wider claim, We would need repeated evidence showing unusually tall people performing consistent social roles across multiple places and periods. Supporters believe that such evidence exists. They often describe these individuals as a specialized group rather than a separate species. In this version of the story, the so-called giants were not mythical beings 30 feet tall. They were humans perhaps 7, 8, 9, or even 10 feet in height, large enough to require different furniture, clothing, tools, and interior proportions, but similar enough to live within ordinary communities. The theory usually assigns them practical positions. Their height and strength would make them useful as guards, military officers, construction workers, ceremonial attendants, or representatives of state authority. A towering official standing at the entrance to a government building would be difficult to ignore. A large worker could move materials that required several ordinary people. A tall administrator placed above a crowd would be visible during ceremonies and public gatherings. There is an obvious attraction to this idea. It offers a single explanation for several categories of unusual evidence. Tall people in photographs become members of the same group that used the oversized chairs. The chairs belong inside the buildings with the tall doors. The tall doors lead into a civilization identified with old maps of Tartaria. The disappearance of the name from later maps then becomes part of a deliberate removal. A connected explanation can feel powerful because it turns scattered objects into a coherent story. Yet the same quality can also create a problem. Once every unusual item is placed inside one theory, ordinary explanations may begin to look like excuses even when they are well supported. Consider a large doorway. The first reaction may be that it was built for a large person. But monumental doors have served many other purposes. They allow crowds, horses, carriages, banners, furniture, religious processions, military formations, and large equipment to pass through. They create ventilation. They bring light into deep interiors. They make a ruler, institution, or religion appear powerful. In a palace or cathedral, making visitors feel small may be the entire point. A tall doorway, therefore, does not automatically indicate a tall user. The more useful question is whether the rest of the building matches the same scale. Are the handles unusually high? Are the desks, toilets, beds, counters, and railings all placed for larger bodies? Are the steps proportionally taller rather than simply wider? Do private rooms show the same dimensions as ceremonial entrances? Many buildings presented as evidence contain a mixture of scales. The main doors are enormous, while ordinary side doors are suitable for average adults. Ceilings rise several stories, but handrails remain at familiar heights. Windows may begin high above the floor, yet fireplaces, benches, and interior fittings do not. This mixed scale usually suggests architectural display rather than a different population. Supporters answer that buildings may have been modified. Floors could have been added, tall rooms could have been divided, door handles could have been lowered, furniture could have been removed. A structure inherited by a later population might retain its outer shell while its interior was adapted. That is possible in individual cases. Buildings are altered constantly. Windows are blocked, floors raised, staircases replaced, and entrances resized. The difficulty is proving why a particular modification occurred. Evidence of renovation is not automatically evidence of adaptation from giant occupants. We would need construction records, original plans, consistent measurements, or physical traces showing that the previous layout was designed around larger human proportions. The same issue appears with oversized furniture. Enormous chairs exist in palaces, museums, public squares, churches, theatres, exhibitions, and ceremonial halls. Some are genuine functional objects. Others are thrones intended to symbolize rank. Some are promotional displays. Some are architectural decorations. Others were built for very tall individuals whose names and medical histories are known. When a chair is photographed without context, it can look like a normal household object enlarged for an unknown user. Place it back inside a ceremonial hall, and its meaning may change completely. A throne raised above a floor surrounded by carved symbols is not necessarily evidence of a 12-foot ruler. It may be an ordinary seat made to appear imposing. Yet there are objects that are hard to dismiss immediately. Antique beds of unusual length, coats with extraordinary measurements, large boots, broad weapons, and heavy industrial tools all appear in collections around the world. Some have clear explanations. A long bed may have been built for a known tall person. A large coat may have belonged to a ceremonial guard. A heavy hammer may have been used with mechanical assistance, or designed for a specific industrial process. Others lack reliable provenance. Their labels may be vague, their original owners are unknown, their dates may be estimates made long after manufacture. When documentation is missing, the object becomes open to competing stories. This is one reason provenance matters so much. Provenance is the recorded history of an object, who owned it, where it was found, how it entered a collection, and whether those details can be verified. Without provenance, a large boot is simply a large boot. It might have belonged to an unusually tall person. It might have been part of a shop display. It might have been theatrical. It might have been made recently and incorrectly described as ancient. The theory of an erased giant class depends heavily on objects whose chains of ownership are incomplete. That does not make the objects meaningless, but it limits what they can prove. The maps introduce a different problem. The word Tartaria appears on many European maps created over several centuries. It usually covered a vast and poorly understood area extending across northern and central Asia. Depending on the period and map maker, there might be Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, or other regional labels. To modern eyes, the large name can resemble the title of a unified country. Some maps spread it across an enormous territory, making Tartary appear comparable to a continental empire. Supporters of the hidden civilization theory argue that later historians reduced this state to a loose geographical term, and eventually removed it from common memory. Mainstream historians explain the label differently. European map makers often use broad names for regions they did not control and did not understand in detail. Tartar, or Tatar, was applied imprecisely to numerous peoples across Eurasia. As exploration, diplomacy, military expansion, and surveying produced more specific information, broad labels were replaced by names such as the Russian Empire, Mongolia, Manchuria, Siberia, Turkestan, and other political or geographical divisions. This process occurred in many parts of the world. Older maps often contain large regional names that vanish as borders and classifications become more precise. A disappearing label therefore does not by itself prove that a civilization was destroyed or erased. The theory becomes more specific when it connects Tartaria to monumental architecture. Supporters point to government buildings, railway stations, exhibition halls, cathedrals, forts, and civic centres constructed or officially opened during the 19th century. They question whether the populations of the time had the labour, machinery, funding, and technical ability to create so many large structures so quickly. They also note that photographs sometimes show impressive buildings surrounded by undeveloped roads, muddy streets, simple wooden houses, or small populations. To them, this suggests that newcomers occupied cities built by an earlier society. There are genuine historical reasons for this visual contrast. Industrial cities often developed unevenly. A government might fund a courthouse, station, cathedral, or exhibition building before paving surrounding streets. Monumental construction could exist beside poverty, temporary housing, and unfinished infrastructure. Photography also became widespread during a period of rapid urban expansion. So many images captured cities while they were still being built around older civic centres. World's fairs and international exhibitions add another layer of confusion. These events produced enormous structures that looked permanent, but were often made from timber, plaster, staff, iron frames, and other materials chosen for speed rather than durability. Photographs can make them appear as solid as stone. Some were later demolished. which has encouraged claims that authorities destroyed inherited architecture. In many cases, however, plans, contracts, architects' names, construction photographs, budgets, and demolition records survive. That documentation does not eliminate every question, but it makes a complete hidden inheritance less likely. The strongest version of the theory requires a coordinated historical transition. A previous civilization must have constructed major buildings and infrastructure. Later governments must have taken possession of them. Records must then have been rewritten or selectively preserved. Museums must have removed human remains. Academic institutions must have reclassified physical evidence. Mapmakers must have abandoned the name Tartaria. Photographs of unusually tall people must have been reframed as entertainment, medical abnormality, or visual distortion. Such a process would involve thousands of people across rival nations, languages, universities, churches, armies, newspapers, and private collections. Large conspiracies are not impossible, but they leave administrative traces. Orders, correspondence, budgets, disagreements, leaks, inventories, and personal accounts usually survive somewhere. The broader the operation, the more evidence we would expect it to produce. Supporters often respond that the removal was gradual rather than centrally directed. Museums may have discarded remains they considered fraudulent. Universities may have preferred theories that matched developing scientific standards. Newspapers may have stopped reporting uncertain discoveries. Governments may have promoted national histories that ignored older regional identities. No single meeting or secret order would be necessary. A series of institutional choices could narrow the acceptable story over several generations. That quieter form of historical loss is much more plausible. Archives are incomplete. Museums have mishandled remains. Archaeological objects have been mislabeled, lost, privately sold, damaged, or destroyed. Colonial institutions have removed material from its original setting. Governments have shaped history for political purposes. Scholars have rejected evidence because it challenged dominant ideas, and sometimes they have been wrong. The important distinction is between ordinary institutional failure and evidence of a specific lost giant civilization. The first is well documented throughout history. The second requires its own direct support. Newspaper reports of giant skeletons are often presented as that support. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, papers in the United States and elsewhere published stories describing skeletons 7, 8, 10, or even 12 feet tall. Some reports name local farmers, labourers, doctors, or amateur archaeologists. A few claim that bones were sent to museums and then disappeared. These accounts deserve attention, but newspapers of the period operated differently from modern scientific publications. Local papers repeated stories from distant sources. Measurements were often estimated. Writers used sensational language to attract readers. Hoaxes were common. Large animal bones could be mistaken for human remains. Burial sites were disturbed without trained excavation, causing bones from multiple individuals to be combined. There were also commercial incentives. A town associated with a giant discovery could attract visitors. A travelling show could turn a fabricated skeleton into income. The famous Cardiff giant, uncovered in New York in 1869, was a carved stone figure deliberately planted as a hoax. Crowds paid to see it, experts argued over it, and copies were produced. The event showed how easily public interest, financial opportunity, and uncertain expertise could turn a false object into a national sensation. That example does not prove that every report was false. It proves that the period contained the exact conditions in which false reports could spread widely. Physical anthropology was also developing at the time. Human remains were collected under practices that would now be considered unethical. Museums accumulated bones from indigenous graves, archaeological sites, prisons, hospitals, and private donors. Records were often poor. Some collections were reorganized or dispersed. Others are now subject to repatriation laws and cultural protections. A claim that remains entered a museum and later became difficult to locate is therefore not automatically suspicious. Large institutions can lose track of objects through renaming, transfers, incomplete catalogues, damage, or storage changes. To establish deliberate removal, we would need a documented skeleton, reliable measurements, identifiable photographs, accession records, and evidence that the institution knowingly concealed or destroyed it. The question of height itself also needs care. Estimating stature from bones is not as simple as laying out a skeleton and measuring from skull to heel. Archaeologists use formulas based on long bones such as the femur and tibia. Different populations have different body proportions. Damaged remains introduce uncertainty. Early excavators may have measured burial spaces rather than bodies. Newspaper writers may then have rounded the figure upward. A burial described as containing an 8-foot skeleton might refer to an 8-foot grave. A collection of bones from several individuals might be assembled into one apparently enormous body. A person slightly over 7 feet tall might become 9 feet tall after several newspapers copied and embellished the original account. This gradual inflation is familiar in folklore. A real event begins the story, but each retelling improves it. The fish grows larger, the storm grows stronger, and the skeleton gains another foot. Photographs seem more reliable because they allow us to look directly at the person, yet images bring their own difficulties. Early lenses could distort proportions near the edges of the frame. Perspective makes a subject closer to the camera appear larger. Uneven ground changes apparent height. Clothing, hats, posture, and footwear add uncertainty. Printed photographs may be cropped, stretched, or copied without their original captions. Circus and exhibition performers were also photographed specifically to emphasize size. A tall person might stand beside a very short performer. Furniture could be scaled down. The camera could be placed low. The resulting image was not necessarily fake, but it was arranged to produce the strongest effect. At the same time, these performers should not be dismissed as irrelevant. They were real people, and their lives tell us how societies treated extreme height. Some earned money through public display because ordinary employment was difficult. Others became celebrities, soldiers, guards, or attendants. A few appeared beside rulers and officials. Their social integration was genuine, even when their photographs were promotional. The theory may therefore begin with a reasonable observation. Unusually tall people were more visible in the 19th century photographic record than many of us realise. The uncertain step comes when those individuals are grouped into a single hidden administrative class and connected to Tartaria without direct documentation. To test that connection, we would need names, family records, employment records, uniforms, salaries, official titles, residences, and repeated associations with specific institutions. We would need evidence that large buildings were designed around their measurements. We would expect specialised clothing workshops, medical accounts, burial records, and perhaps communities where unusual height appeared across generations. Some of that material may exist for individual tall people. Whether it forms the pattern claimed by the theory is the question we will keep returning to. For now, the safest starting point is neither immediate belief nor immediate ridicule. Old evidence should be examined in its original context whenever possible. Captions matter, dates matter, measurements matter. The difference between a ceremonial object and an everyday object matters. The difference between a regional label and a political state matters. Most of all, the difference between possibility and proof matters. With those ground rules in place, we can move closer to the faces at the centre of the story. The next evidence does not begin with a map or a doorway, but with people standing in front of cameras, tall men in formal coats, towering women beside ordinary crowds, guards who seem to rise above their units, and unidentified figures whose photographs have travelled far beyond the archives where they began. Those photographs are where the theory becomes most persuasive to many people, because a photograph feels different from a rumour. A newspaper can exaggerate. A map can use an unfamiliar label. A museum object can lose its original description. A photograph appears to place the past directly in front of us. There stands the person, surrounded by others, with a face, clothing, hands, and feet that seem impossible to explain away. In one image, a tall man rises above a row of soldiers. His shoulders are level with the heads of the men beside him, and the top of his hat appears almost absurdly high. In another, a woman in a long dress stands near a group of formally dressed visitors. She seems to be nearly twice the height of the smallest person present. Elsewhere, a large man rests one hand on the back of a chair, while several ordinary adults gather around him, each one appearing small enough to reach only his chest. Images like these circulate with captions describing royal guards, Tartarian officials, giant builders, or members of a forgotten administrative class. The captions often invite the same question. Why were so many unusually tall people being photographed during the 19th century, and why do we hear so little about them now? Before answering, it helps to understand what an old photograph actually tells us. A camera records light, but it does not automatically record context. It cannot tell us who arranged the scene, why the people were gathered, how far each person stood from the lens, or whether the furniture was made for daily use. It cannot tell us whether a handwritten caption was added at the time or a century later. It cannot explain whether the image was documentary, commercial, theatrical, or humorous. That missing context creates space for interpretation. A photograph found in a family album may once have been completely ordinary to the people who owned it. The names of the subjects were known. The occasion was remembered. Everyone understood why one man was unusually tall or why a chair was unusually small. Once the album is separated from the family, however, the image becomes mysterious. A later viewer sees only what remains inside the frame. Many photographs now presented as evidence of giants originally belonged to the world of public entertainment. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, unusually tall men and women could become internationally famous. They appeared in travelling exhibitions, circuses, theatres, fairs, royal courts, and private receptions. Their height was advertised on posters and printed cards. Audiences paid to stand beside them, shake their hands, and purchase portraits as souvenirs. These people were not imaginary. Some were extraordinarily tall, and several reached heights that would still attract worldwide attention today. Their existence shows that the past included individuals whose bodies fell far outside the average range. It also shows that photography preserved them more often than it preserved ordinary people because their appearance had commercial value. A farmer of average height might be photographed once for a wedding or family portrait. A travelling giant might be photographed hundreds of times in different cities, wearing different costumes and standing beside different groups. When those pictures are later removed from their original collections and shared individually, one person can begin to look like many. This repetition is easy to miss online. The same tall performer may appear under several names because the image has been cropped, reversed, colorized, or copied from a different print. A photograph taken in a studio may be described as Russia in one post, France in another, and North America in a third. The location changes, the date changes, and the person becomes evidence for a wider population that the original image never claimed to represent. Commercial photography encouraged visual exaggeration. A tall performer was not usually placed beside another tall adult. That would weaken the effect. The photographer selected shorter companions, low furniture, and camera positions that increased the difference. Children might be included because they made the central figure appear even larger. A walking stick, doorway, or table could provide scale, but only if its dimensions were known. Some portraits used a simple arrangement that still works today. The tallest person stood slightly closer to the camera, while the others remained a step or two behind. The difference might not be obvious because early studio backgrounds provided few reliable depth clues. Everyone appeared to be standing in the same line, even when they were not. A small change in distance could add a surprising amount of apparent height. This does not mean the subject was of ordinary size. A person could be genuinely 7 feet tall, and still be photographed in a way that made them appear 9 feet tall. The image would contain truth and exaggeration at the same time, which is far more common than a simple choice between genuine and fake. Military photographs require a different kind of care. Armies have often recruited tall men for ceremonial units, palace guards, grenadier regiments, and public duties. Height creates visual uniformity and authority. A ruler surrounded by large guards appears protected. A state represented by physically imposing soldiers looks powerful. Some units imposed minimum height requirements, while others placed the tallest soldiers at the ends or centre of a formation. A very tall guard in a group photograph may therefore have been socially integrated and officially employed. That part of the theory can be correct without requiring a hidden civilization. Tall people did serve visible roles. They were sometimes selected precisely because their height attracted attention. The more difficult claim is that they formed a separate administrative group, connected across continents. A photograph of one tall guard in Russia and another tall guard in Britain does not show that the two belong to the same institution. It shows that different states understood the symbolic value of height. Uniforms can offer useful clues. Buttons, insignia, medals, belts, hats, and collar designs may identify a regiment or service. When an image is examined in high resolution, these details can sometimes connect the subject to surviving military records. A person described online as an unknown Tartarian guardian may turn out to be a named ceremonial soldier, whose unit, salary, birthplace and years of service are documented. At other times, the identification remains uncertain. The photograph may be a later copy. The uniform may be theatrical. The insignia may be blurred beyond recognition. Uncertainty should remain uncertainty. It should not automatically become proof of suppression. Clothing itself can distort apparent proportions. 19th century coats often had long vertical lines that emphasized height. Tall hats added several inches. High-waisted trousers made legs appear longer. Dark clothing against a light background could make the figure seem narrower and therefore taller. Women's dresses concealed the exact position of the feet, especially when the skirt touched the floor. A raised platform or hidden step could change the entire measurement without appearing in the photograph. Footwear matters as well. Boots with thick soles, ceremonial shoes, and raised heels were not always visible beneath long clothing. If a person stood beside companions wearing flat shoes, the difference increased. None of these factors can explain every image, but together they show why estimating exact height from a single photograph is unreliable. The most convincing photographs are those containing a known object positioned on the same plane as the subject. A standard door, measured chair, marked wall, or named companion of recorded height can provide scale. Even then, lens distortion and posture must be considered. A person standing straight beside someone who is leaning or bending can gain several apparent inches. Modern researchers sometimes use proportional analysis. They compare head length, shoulder height, arm span, and nearby objects to estimate the subject's stature. This can be useful, but the result is only as good as the assumptions. Human heads are not identical in size. Doors are not all standard. Hats conceal the top of the skull. Shoes conceal the position of the heel. Copies of old photographs may have been stretched during printing or scanning. A small error in one measurement can become a large error in the final estimate. Someone calculated at 9 feet might actually have been 7 feet 6 inches. Still very tall, but not evidence of an unknown human type. There are also images that were deliberately manipulated. Photomontage began early in the history of photography. Skilled printers combined negatives, altered backgrounds, removed people, and created scenes that never existed as a single moment. Spirit photographers placed ghostly figures beside grieving families. Comic postcards showed enormous vegetables, giant fish, and people sitting on impossible animals. Audiences understood that many of these pictures were jokes or novelties. When such an image loses its original caption, the joke can become evidence. A promotional photograph of a giant standing over a miniature street may be reposted as a documentary scene. A theatrical group may be described as government officials. A costume may be interpreted as an unknown uniform. The reverse problem also occurs. A real photograph may be dismissed as fake simply because the subject looks extraordinary. This is why careful examination should not begin with the desired conclusion. The first question should be practical. Where did the image come from? Is the earliest available version known? Does it have a photographer's mark? Was it printed as a cabinet card, newspaper illustration, postcard, or private photograph? Are names written on the back? Can the clothing be dated? Does another copy contain a fuller caption? Cabinet cards were especially popular during the late 19th century. They consisted of photographs mounted on stiff card, often with the studio's name printed below. Performers sold them in large numbers. The studio information can reveal where the picture was taken, while advertisements and city directories may identify the subject. When only the central figure is shared online, the studio mark is often removed. That crop eliminates the very information needed to understand the photograph. The mysterious giant remains, while the evidence explaining who they were disappears at the edge of the image. The idea of erasure can therefore arise from ordinary copying. Someone crops a photograph to focus attention on the unusual person. Another account downloads the crop and writes a new caption. A third adds a claim about Tartaria. After enough repetitions, the original description becomes difficult to find. It may look as though historians removed the truth when, in fact, internet circulation removed the context. There is still something important in these photographs that should not be overlooked. Unusually tall people were often treated as public property. Their bodies were measured, advertised, compared, and displayed. Newspapers described their meals, hand size, shoe size, sleeping arrangements, and marriages. Audiences felt entitled to stare at them. Doctors examined them. Promoters controlled their schedules. Even after death, some faced the possibility that their bodies or skeletons would be collected. A caption calling someone a giant can hide the person behind the spectacle. They had families, ambitions, illnesses, private opinions, and ordinary frustrations. They were not merely examples of height. Some chose exhibition work because it offered financial independence. Others had few alternatives because employers did not know how to accommodate them. Clothing had to be made specially. Travel was uncomfortable. Furniture rarely fit. Joint pain and circulation problems were common among those whose height resulted from hormonal disorders. Seen in that light, the photographs document something more complicated than a forgotten ruling class. They show how industrial societies turned unusual bodies into entertainment, while also placing some of those bodies in respected ceremonial roles. Supporters of the Tartarian interpretation focus on another group of images, tall figures who do not appear to be performers. They stand among officials, engineers, railway workers, surveyors, or construction crews. No circus banner is visible. No promotional text describes their height. They look like ordinary members of the group except for their scale. These images deserve closer attention because they cannot all be explained by show business. Very tall people worked outside entertainment. They served in armies, worked on farms, entered trades, married, travelled, and held public positions. A group photograph may record one of those lives without making height the subject. The key question is whether these individuals appear frequently enough in consistent roles to indicate a recognised class. That requires more than collecting striking examples. We would need to know the total number of photographs examined. If 10 tall figures appear among millions of surviving images, rarity is the likely explanation. If hundreds appear in the same type of official position, the pattern becomes more significant. This is a basic problem of selection. Online collections show us only the photographs chosen because they look unusual. We do not see the thousands of ordinary group portraits that were ignored. Without that comparison, frequency is difficult to judge. Imagine opening an archive containing 100,000 photographs and selecting the 50 strangest. Viewed together, those 50 may suggest a world filled with giants, unexplained machines, empty cities, and impossible architecture. yet they represent only a tiny and deliberately unusual fraction of the whole collection. The theory sometimes interprets formal posture as evidence of authority. A tall person stands in the centre while others gather around. The central position may indicate rank, but it may also have been chosen simply because placing the tallest person at the side would unbalance the composition. Photographers arrange groups carefully. Tall adults often stood at the back or centre, shorter adults at the front, and children seated below. When a person appears to be holding a staff, rod, or long object, it may be described as a symbol of office. It might also be a walking cane. Extremely tall people sometimes use canes for balance and joint support. A functional object can acquire political meaning once the original explanation is lost. Facial expressions are interpreted in similar ways. A serious face may be called evidence of military discipline or elite status. In reality, long exposure times and portrait conventions encourage subjects to remain still and unsmiling. The stern appearance belonged to the photographic process as much as to the person. Questions also surround photographs of large women. They are sometimes described as members of royal bloodlines or a giant ruling caste. Their long dresses and formal settings make them appear especially imposing. Yet tall women were prominent in travelling exhibitions, where they were presented as queens, brides, noblewomen, or representatives of distant countries. The titles were often inventions created by promoters. Marriage between tall performers was heavily advertised. Posters promised audiences the tallest couple in the world. Wedding photographs were sold. Children, when present, attracted further attention. A commercial family narrative could later be mistaken for evidence of a hereditary giant class. Hereditary height is certainly possible. Families can contain several unusually tall members. Populations also differ in average stature because of genetics, diet, health, and living conditions. To establish a distinct historical group, however, researchers would need skeletal, genetic, genealogical, and documentary evidence. Photographs alone cannot provide all of that. The period from the middle of the 19th century into the early 20th century appears central to the theory partly because photography became widely available then. Earlier centuries may have had equally tall individuals, but they were recorded in paintings, written descriptions, or not at all. Later periods developed better medical documentation, making extreme height easier to classify as gigantism, acromegaly, or ordinary genetic variation. This creates the appearance of a sudden concentration. Giants seem to emerge when cameras appear and vanish when medical categories become more precise. The change may reflect documentation rather than population. Photography also transformed public memory. A written account saying that a man was of remarkable stature leaves room for doubt. A photograph gives the impression that we can measure him ourselves. We trust the image because we're doing the looking. Yet we are usually looking at a compressed copy on a screen, separated from its physical print, caption, archive, and original purpose. The safest approach is to treat each photograph as an individual case. Some show known performers, some show exceptionally tall workers or soldiers. Some use perspective tricks. Some may be altered. Others remain genuinely unidentified. A few may preserve information that has not yet been properly researched. Placing every image into one explanation weakens the investigation because it ignores the differences between them. A promotional portrait and a construction photograph do not carry the same evidential weight. A named person with surviving records is not equivalent to an unknown figure in a damaged print. An image with measurable objects is more useful than one with a blank studio background. There is also no reason to assume that identifying a medical condition makes a person historically unimportant. The phrase isolated anomaly can sound dismissive, as though an individual does not count unless they belong to a larger hidden group. In fact, one person of extraordinary size could influence architecture, clothing, furniture, and local stories without representing a separate population. A palace might commission an unusually large chair for a celebrated guard. A hotel might build a special bed for a famous visitor. A military unit might alter a uniform. Those objects could survive after the person's name was forgotten, leaving later observers to wonder who used them. This offers one possible bridge between the photographs and the oversized objects. Some large furniture may indeed have been made for large people, but that does not mean all monumental furniture had the same purpose. The connection must be established object by object. The more ambitious version of the theory proposes that the photographed figures were supervising a transition. They appear beside new governments, military units, railways and building projects because they represented the older order. Their gradual disappearance from photographs is then interpreted as the final stage of that transition. It is an interesting narrative, but a narrative is not yet evidence. To test it, we would need a reliable timeline showing when the figures appeared, where they served, and how their roles changed. We would need records connecting them to Tartary or Tartaria by name. We would also need to explain why no consistent language, insignia, legal status or administrative title appears across the images. Without those links, the photographs show unusually tall humans living within 19th century society, something already supported by ordinary history. They do not independently show that those humans governed a lost civilization. Even so, the images continue to hold attention because they make the past look less familiar than textbooks often suggest. They remind us that real historical populations included a greater variety of bodies, occupations, costumes and social arrangements than simplified summaries can capture. They also remind us how easily context can be lost when images move from albums to archives, from archives to books, and from books to social media. A photograph may preserve a person while erasing the explanation of who they were. That is a genuine form of historical loss, though not necessarily an organised one. The tall figures are therefore useful starting points, but they cannot carry the entire theory. To move beyond individual bodies, we have to examine the spaces supposedly designed for them. That takes us away from studio curtains and military formations and into railway stations, courthouses, palaces, museums and government halls, where doors rise far above the people passing through them, and staircases seem wide enough for occupants built on a very different scale. The first thing many people notice in these buildings is not the stonework, the carvings or the height of the ceiling. It is the door. Across old railway stations, courthouses, palaces, museums, city halls, churches and government buildings, there are entrances that appear far larger than necessary for an ordinary person. Some rise 12 feet, others reach 15 feet or more. Their frames are heavy, their handles sometimes seem oddly placed, and the steps leading toward them can be so broad that a modern visitor looks small even before entering. Supporters of the giant theory ask a straightforward question. Why build doors on that scale unless someone on that scale was expected to use them? At first, the argument feels convincing. A door is a practical object. It exists to allow a body or an object to pass through a wall. A chair may be ceremonial, a statue may be symbolic, and a tower may be decorative, but a doorway appears to have a clear function. If the opening is enormous, perhaps the user was enormous too. That conclusion becomes even more tempting when several large features appear together. A tall entrance leads into a hall with a high ceiling. The staircase is unusually wide. The windows begin well above the floor. The rooms contain large fireplaces, thick railings, and heavy doors that look difficult for one person to move. An ordinary adult walking through the space can seem like a child visiting a house built for someone else. This visual effect is real. Monumental architecture is designed to alter the way a person feels. It controls movement, attention, and scale. A visitor approaching a large public building is often meant to understand, before reading a single inscription, that the institution inside is powerful. A courthouse needs to represent authority. A palace needs to represent rank. A cathedral needs to represent something larger than daily life. A railway station from the age of steam needed to announce speed, industry, and national ambition. Large doors and high ceilings were not accidental excesses. They were part of the message. This does not automatically settle the question. because symbolic architecture still has to function. Builders had to decide how large the doors should be, how the stairs would be used, and what kinds of traffic would move through the building. The most useful way to examine these structures is therefore not to ask whether they look large, but to ask what had to pass through them. In many religious and ceremonial buildings, entrances were designed for processions. Clergy, officials, musicians, banners, decorated platforms, and crowds might enter together. A narrow domestic doorway would interrupt that movement. Large openings allowed ceremonies to remain organised and visible. Government buildings had similar needs. Important halls received groups rather than individuals. Furniture, documents, equipment, and display objects had to be moved in and out. Before modern freight elevators, large items often travelled through the same doors used by people. A doorway that seems excessive for one person may be entirely reasonable for a large cabinet, a ceremonial carriage, or a group carrying a heavy object. Railway stations were built for luggage carts, parcels, crowds, and sometimes animals. Industrial buildings had to admit machinery. Fire stations needed space for wagons and horses. Market halls handled crates and produce. Military buildings moved formations, weapons, and supplies. The body of the average visitor was only one part of the design problem. There was also ventilation. Before electric cooling and modern mechanical systems, large interiors managed heat and air partly through volume. High ceilings allowed warm air to rise. Tall windows improved circulation and brought daylight deeper into rooms. Large doors could be opened to move air through crowded spaces. This matters in buildings where hundreds or thousands of people gathered wearing heavy clothing and using gas lamps, candles, coal stoves, or steam equipment. A low, tightly sealed room would have become unpleasant very quickly. High volume was not simply decoration. It helped the building remain usable. Supporters of the theory often answer that these explanations account for a few grand entrances, but not for the repeated scale seen across entire districts. They point to cities where monumental doors appear on banks, post offices, schools, hospitals, and administrative buildings. If all of them were designed only for ceremony, they ask, why does the same pattern appear in so many ordinary institutions? Part of the answer is architectural fashion. Styles travel. Governments copy one another. Architects study the same classical models. A successful design used in one capital is repeated in provincial cities. Columns, arches, large windows, raised entrances, and broad stairs become visual signs of permanence and legitimacy. During the 19th century, rapidly expanding states wanted buildings that looked older, stronger, and more established than the institutions they housed. A new government office might borrow the appearance of ancient Rome. A bank might resemble a temple. A railway station might be designed like a palace. The architecture gave modern organisations the visual authority of the older civilizations. This produced a strange contrast. Inside, clerks handled paperwork, customers waited in line, and workers complained about the heating. Outside, the building looked ready to receive an emperor. Large scale was also useful in a period when public buildings competed with the growing size of cities. A modest entrance could disappear behind traffic, advertisements, and surrounding construction. A tall doorway remained visible from a distance. It helped people identify the main entrance, especially before illuminated signs and digital directions. Still, some features remain difficult to understand at first glance. One common example is the door handle that appears too high for ordinary use. Photographs circulate showing handles at shoulder level or above. These are described as evidence that the doors were made for people much taller than us. Sometimes the explanation is simple. The visible object is not the main handle. It may be a decorative plate, a pull used only when closing the door, a latch connected to a lower mechanism, or part of a later modification. A second handle may be hidden by the camera angle. In double doors, one leaf may have bolts placed high and low to secure it, while the other leaf is used regularly. Old doors also changed over the time. A tall original opening might later receive smaller inner doors. Handles were replaced. Locks were moved, steps were added or removed. A photograph taken after several renovations can make the arrangement seem more mysterious than it was when first built. To understand a doorway, the entire threshold has to be examined. The height of the handle matters, but so does the wear on the floor, the direction of the hinges, the location of locks, the width of each leaf, and the presence of smaller side entrances. Architectural plans can show whether the opening was intended for daily use, ceremony, ventilation, or transport. The same caution applies to staircases. Broad stairs are frequently presented as evidence that the original occupants had longer legs or larger feet. In photographs, people appear almost lost on the steps. Each flight may stretch across a hall wide enough for several families to climb side by side. Width, however, is not the same as step height. A staircase can be extremely wide while using ordinary risers and treads. Monumental stairs were often designed for crowds, formal entrances, and controlled movement. They also created a stage-like approach, allowing a building to be seen gradually as visitors climbed. If a staircase had truly been made for people twice our height, we would expect the vertical rise of each step to be much greater. An ordinary person would have to lift the knee unusually high. The tread depth would also increase to match a much larger foot. Railings would sit above comfortable hand level. Landings, door thresholds, and interior stairs would repeat the same proportions. In many supposed examples, the steps are wide but not abnormally tall. Their scale is civic, not anatomical. They were made for many people, not necessarily larger people. There are exceptions. Some old stairs do have high risers, uneven treads, and awkward dimensions. These can result from later floor changes, limited space, old building practices, or different expectations about comfort. Stairs were not always designed according to modern safety codes. A steep flight that feels strange today may simply reflect a time when accessibility and uniformity received less attention. Supporters sometimes point to windows placed far above the ground. If ordinary people lived there, why would a window begin at head height or higher? The answer depends on the room. In factories, high windows brought in light while leaving wall space for machinery. In churches, they directed attention upward and protected interior privacy. In prisons, forts, and government offices, high windows improved security. In urban buildings, the apparent ground floor may originally have been partly below street level, especially if roads were raised later. Street levels change frequently. Cities added paving, drainage, sewer systems, tram lines, and new road surfaces. Repeated rebuilding could raise the street outside a building, making lower windows appear buried. In other places, soil was removed, exposing foundations and making entrances seem unusually high. This brings us to one of the more popular ideas connected with Tartaria, the claim that many buildings have buried lower floors because a widespread mud flood covered older cities. Windows found partly below ground are often presented as remains of a catastrophe that authorities later concealed. There are documented cases of cities raising street levels. Chicago lifted buildings and roads during the 19th century to improve drainage. Parts of Seattle were rebuilt above older streets after the Great Fire. Rome, London, Moscow, and many other cities contain layers created by centuries of demolition, rebuilding, flooding, and accumulated material. These examples show that buried architecture is real. They do not by themselves prove one global disaster. Similar results can come from different local causes. A basement window in one city may have been built below ground from the beginning. Another may have become buried when a road was raised. A third may belong to an older building level covered by later construction. To establish a worldwide event, the buried layers would need to share a consistent date, material, depth, and geological explanation. Local records would need to show a sudden disruption across regions. Instead, the evidence usually varies from city to city. The giant theory sometimes connects these buried floors to a change in occupants. The original entrances, it is argued, were tall enough for large people. After the lower portion was covered, the remaining doorway fit ordinary humans. Windows became basements, and upper floors became ground floors. This is an imaginative explanation, but it can be tested. If a 12-foot doorway lost 6 feet beneath the soil, the hinges, thresholds, wear patterns and internal floor levels should reveal the change. In many cases, what appears to be the lower half of a tall entrance is actually a basement opening or a separate architectural feature. In others, renovations are visible but do not support a single dramatic burial. Old photographs are especially useful here. They can show street levels before later construction. Fire insurance maps, engineering records, sewer plans, and property documents can reveal when changes occurred. The answer is often less dramatic than a buried civilization, but it may still involve major urban transformation. Another feature frequently discussed is the scale of interior halls. Some public rooms are so tall that a person seems almost unnecessary within them. Columns rise through multiple stories. Doors are topped by arches and windows. Balconies overlook spaces large enough for hundreds of people. Such rooms were rarely built for domestic comfort. They were built for visibility, sound, circulation and display. A legislature needed members to see and hear proceedings. A stock exchange required traders to gather in one open area. A station concourse had to absorb crowds arriving from several platforms. A museum needed wall space for large paintings and sculptures. A palace ballroom had to accommodate dances, ceremonies, and court presentations. Scale also helped manage smoke and lighting. Gas chandeliers, oil lamps, and fireplaces produced heat and fumes. A high ceiling kept some of that away from the occupants below. Large windows reduced dependence on artificial light during the day. Acoustics played a role as well. Domes, vaults, and hard surfaces could amplify voices, music, and announcements. They could also create echoes so severe that ordinary conversation became difficult, which suggests that builders did not always succeed. Monumental architecture has never been immune to bad planning. Supporters often raise a practical objection. Even if there were reasons to build at that scale, how did 19th century populations construct so much so quickly? Photographs show enormous stone buildings appearing in young cities with limited machinery and unpaved roads. The official timelines can seem too short. This question deserves a serious answer, because large construction projects did require remarkable organisation. Workers quarried stone, fired brick, transported timber, cast iron, shaped metal, erected scaffolding, and moved materials using horses, cranes, pulleys, rail systems, barges, and steam power. Labour was dangerous, injuries were common, and workdays were long. The machinery may look simple by modern standards, but simple machines can move enormous loads when combined with manpower, animal power, counterweights, and careful planning. Ancient societies built large monuments without modern engines. The 19th century added industrial production, standardized parts, expanding rail networks, and steam-driven equipment. Photographs of construction sites sometimes make the workforce look small, because only a few people were present when the picture was taken. Long exposure times made active workers difficult to capture clearly. Photographers preferred moments when movement was limited. A nearly empty image does not mean the building was constructed by a handful of people. Records often list contractors, labour costs, material suppliers, architects, engineers, and completion dates. These documents can be dull, which is perhaps why they circulate less widely than a mysterious photograph. A ledger recording 6,000 loads of stone is not as exciting as the idea of an inherited giant palace, but it is the kind of evidence that explains how a structure was built. That said, official records are not always complete. Buildings were expanded, repaired, and renamed. Architects took credit for work done by large teams. Political leaders attached their names to projects that began before their administration. Some structures reused foundations, walls, or materials from older buildings. Reuse is normal in architecture. A new government may occupy an older palace. A railway company may convert a military site. A church may stand on the remains of a temple. A A courthouse may incorporate stone from a demolished fort. When later histories simplify this process, they can make a complex building appear to have been created all at once. This is one area where the theory asks a useful question: how much of the built environment was inherited rather than newly created? The answer is often more than official opening dates suggest. A building inaugurated in 1890 may include earlier foundations. A facade may be new while the interior is older. A structure described as rebuilt may retain most of its original walls. Political changes can cause buildings to be reassigned and their earlier functions forgotten. None of this requires giant occupants, but it does show why dates should be read carefully. Built, completed, opened, restored, and reconstructed do not always mean the same thing. Claims about enormous doors also need to distinguish between the opening and the movable door itself. A high arch may contain a much smaller functional doorway. Glass panels, fan lights, carved sections, and fixed upper leaves can fill the remaining space. From a distance, the entire composition looks like one 15-foot door, even though only the lower 8 feet open. In other cases, the whole door did open because the building needed to admit vehicles, statues, machinery, or ceremonial structures. Large hinges and counterweights made movement possible. Some doors included smaller pedestrian openings, so the full leaf did not need to be used every time. This arrangement appears in barns, castles, industrial halls, and city gates. A large entrance handles occasional large traffic, while a smaller opening handles daily human movement. The presence of both scales in the same structure usually argues against a single population of giant users. Supporters reply that smaller openings may have been added after the original builders disappeared. That can happen, but the date of the modification needs evidence. If the smaller door uses the same materials, design, and hardware as the larger structure, it may have been part of the original plan. Measurements are essential. Online discussions often describe doors as 12 or 15 feet tall, based only on appearance. When plans or site measurements are available, the dimensions may be lower. A wide-angle lens can exaggerate vertical space. A person standing closer to the camera can look smaller relative to the background. Sloping ground adds another distortion. There are genuine 15-foot doors, of course. The question is what their proportions indicate. A doorway intended for a 10-foot person would not only be tall, its handle, lock, viewing opening, threshold, and surrounding furniture would need to match that user. The repeated absence of those proportional details is a serious weakness in the claim. Consider an office with a 14-foot entrance but desks built for ordinary bodies, writing surfaces at ordinary height, and fireplaces positioned for seated adults. If giants work there regularly, the interior would require extensive accommodation. A tall door alone would not solve the problem. Beds would need to be longer, chairs would need deeper seats and higher backs for practical reasons, not merely decoration. Tables would rise, shelves used daily would be higher, wash basins, mirrors, kitchen surfaces and handrails would reflect the same scale. Clothing storage would be larger. Even the spacing between floors might change. A socially integrated class could use separate rooms and furniture, but records should mention those arrangements. Buildings designed for mixed populations would likely contain parallel scales, much as modern buildings include features for different needs. This is why the next group of objects matters. Oversized chairs, unusually long beds, enormous coats, broad boots, heavy hammers, and industrial tools appear to provide the missing interior evidence. If the architecture is large and the objects are large, perhaps the two belong together. Before moving to those objects, one more architectural detail deserves attention: the emotional power of scale. People often assume that a building's size reflects the body of its user, because homes generally do. Domestic architecture is closely tied to human dimensions. A kitchen counter, bed, chair, and doorway all respond to the body. Public architecture follows a different logic. Its user is not only the individual, its user may be the crowd, the state, the ceremony, the machine, or the institution itself. A hall can be oversized because it represents authority, rather than because anyone living inside is oversized. This does not make the building meaningless as evidence. It means the evidence has to be read at the correct level. A monumental doorway tells us that the builders wanted to move something large, impress someone, admit many people, ventilate a hall, or combine several purposes. It does not tell us which explanation is correct without additional context. The buildings connected to Tartaria often combine genuine historical puzzles with familiar architectural practices. Some have uncertain construction histories. Some reused older foundations. Some were altered after fires, wars, floods, or political change. Some contain blocked windows and strange floor levels. Others are well documented from the first sketch to the final stone. Treating all of them as identical removes the very differences that could help identify something unusual. A courthouse in North America, a palace in Russia, a mosque in Central Asia, and a station in Europe may share arches and large doors while having completely different histories. A stronger investigation would group buildings by date, function, material, and documented alterations. It would compare measurements rather than impressions. It would identify which features truly exceed practical requirements and which belong to known styles. It would examine whether unexplained examples cluster in a particular region or period. If a consistent pattern remained after that work, the case would become more interesting. If the pattern disappeared once ceremonial entrances, industrial access, urban rebuilding, and architectural fashion were accounted for, then the visual mystery would have a more ordinary explanation. For now, the buildings show that earlier societies were willing to construct on a scale that can feel excessive today. They had the labour, methods, and political reasons to create spaces that dwarfed the individual. They also inherited, altered, and reused structures in ways that modern summaries sometimes conceal. Whether any of those spaces were designed for unusually tall people cannot be decided by the doors alone. The answer would have to continue inside, into the rooms, workshops, storage areas, and collections where objects survive that appear too large for ordinary hands and bodies. Some were ceremonial, some were industrial, some belonged to known individuals. A few remain difficult to explain, and those are the pieces that supporters believe complete the picture. Inside museums, palaces, military collections, factories, workshops, and private archives, there are objects that appear to support the same question raised by the buildings. Some chairs are so large that an ordinary adult can sit in them with room to spare. Certain beds are unusually long. Heavy coats and boots survive in sizes far beyond what most people would ever need. Industrial tools look almost impossible to lift, while sections of old machinery seem to have been designed around operators with extraordinary strength. Placed beside photographs of unusually tall people and buildings with oversized entrances, these objects seem to form a connected set. A tall person requires a tall door. A tall person also requires a larger chair, a longer bed, bigger clothing, and tools suited to a larger body. If enough of these objects appear in the same period, the theory argues, then perhaps they were not isolated curiosities. Perhaps they belonged to a population whose presence was once ordinary enough to shape manufacturing and architecture. The chair is usually the first object presented because its proportions are easy to understand. Everyone knows how a chair fits the human body. The seat supports the legs, the back supports the torso, and the arms rest at a comfortable height. If a chair is twice the usual size, the immediate assumption is that it was made for a person twice the usual size. That assumption can be correct. Special chairs have been built for exceptionally tall people, and some are preserved with reliable records identifying their owners. Royal households, travelling exhibitions, hospitals, and wealthy families could commission furniture for a person who did not fit standard dimensions. A chair made for someone over 7 feet tall would have a higher seat, deeper base, stronger frame, and wider arm spacing. If the person had difficulty standing, the design might include additional support. The problem begins when scale is judged from photographs rather than measurements. A chair may look enormous because a child is sitting in it, because it is placed on a raised platform, or because the camera is close to the seat and farther from the people behind it. Wide-angle lenses exaggerate objects near the edge of the frame. A chair photographed alone gives no reliable sense of size unless another measured object appears beside it. Even when the chair is genuinely large, function matters. Thrones were often designed to make rulers appear more important. Some were placed on platforms surrounded by canopies, carved animals, religious symbols and decorative panels. The actual seat could be ordinary while the structure around it rose several feet above the ruler's head. From a distance, the complete object appears to be a giant chair, although only a small portion was used by the body. Other ceremonial chairs were intentionally uncomfortable and rarely used. Their purpose was to represent an office rather than provide a practical place to sit. A ruler might occupy one for a short audience, public ceremony, or official portrait. The scale communicated authority to everyone in the room. Churches also contain large chairs, stalls, and raised seats that can be misread when removed from context. A bishop's throne may include steps, a canopy, and carved panels. Choir stalls may have tall backs to improve acoustics, divide space, or create a uniform architectural line. The back can rise several feet above the seated person without indicating unusual height. Public exhibitions created another category. Oversized chairs were built as attractions. Visitors climbed into them for photographs, just as they still do with giant shoes, teacups, and benches in tourist areas. Some promoted furniture businesses by demonstrating craftsmanship. Others advertised hotels, fairs, or local industries. An enormous wooden chair outside a workshop could function as a sign visible from a distance. Once the object enters a museum without its original setting, however, the promotional purpose may be forgotten. A large chair displayed against a plain wall looks more serious than the same chair standing outside a shop with an advertisement attached. To decide whether a chair was made for a very tall user, the most useful measurements are not the overall height but the body contact points. The distance from the floor to the seat matters. So does the depth of the seat, the position of the armrests, and the angle of the back. Decorative extensions tell us little about the user's body. A chair with a 12-foot back may still have a seat only 18 inches from the floor. That is an ordinary chair with monumental decoration. A chair with a seat 3 feet above the floor, a deep base, and armrests placed unusually far apart presents a more interesting case. Even then, it may have been theatrical or symbolic, but the design at least corresponds to a larger body. The same method applies to beds. Photographs of long antique beds are frequently used as evidence of giant occupants. Some appear to stretch far beyond the height of the people standing beside them. Yet beds can be deceptive objects. A bed frame may include large posts, steps, storage, curtains, and decorative structures extending beyond the mattress. The total length of the frame does not necessarily match the sleeping area. Old beds were also built for several people, especially in inns, military settings, hospitals, and large households. A wide or long sleeping platform might accommodate a family, rather than one enormous individual. Some beds had functional reasons for extra length. Wealthy owners slept partly upright, supported by cushions. Servants could remain nearby. Pets, warming pans, and personal objects occupied space around the sleeper. In colder regions, heavy curtains enclosed the bed, creating a smaller heated area within a large room. There are also known beds built as attractions or prestige objects. The Great Bed of Ware in England, for example, became famous for its size and was designed to accommodate several people. Its scale demonstrated the wealth of an inn and attracted travellers. An observer seeing it without that history might assume it belonged to a single very large person. Still, specially made beds for tall individuals did exist. When records identify the owner and the mattress dimensions match the person's height, the explanation is clear. These examples show that unusual furniture can be real without implying a hidden population. One person with unusual needs is enough to produce one unusual object. Clothing provides more direct information because it follows the body closely. Large coats, uniforms, dresses, gloves, and boots can preserve the proportions of the wearer. A doorway can be ceremonial, and a chair can be decorative, but a sleeve must reach an arm. A boot must fit a foot. A pair of trousers must cover a leg. For that reason, authenticated clothing belonging to an unknown person of extreme size would be important evidence. It could estimate height, shoulder width, limb length, and body shape. If many such garments appeared with similar dates and locations, they might reveal a larger pattern. The difficulty is that most oversized clothing displayed online has an explanation that is omitted from the caption. Some garments belong to known tall performers. Others were made for ceremonial statues, shop displays, theatre productions, or advertising. A giant boot outside a shoemaker's shop was not intended to be worn. It showed passing customers what the business sold. Military equipment introduces its own problems. Bearskin hats, tall helmets, long coats, and broad-shouldered decorations were designed to increase apparent size. Ceremonial uniforms often made soldiers look taller and more imposing than they were. A coat spread flat in a museum case can look enormous because the fabric includes folds, linings, capes, and decorative panels. Armour is also frequently misunderstood. Large suits may have been ceremonial, made for display, or assembled from mismatched pieces. Some were designed for horses rather than humans. Others belong to unusually large but not gigantic people. A helmet and breastplate can look much larger than the wearer because armour requires space for padding and movement. The strongest clothing evidence would include clear provenance, known measurements, wear marks, repairs, and signs of repeated use. A boot with a worn sole and a shaped interior tells a different story from a hollow display boot. A coat with altered seams may reveal that it was adapted for several users. Labels, tailor marks, military records, and family inventories can identify the owner. Unfortunately, the most dramatic objects often appear without those details. A photograph shows a huge coat hanging in a museum, but the museum name is missing. A large boot is described as ancient, although no date is provided. A pair of gloves is placed beside a modern hand, but there is no scale or collection record. Without documentation, it becomes easy to connect any large object to Tartaria. The object appears in Russia, Europe, Asia, or North America, and the broad geography is treated as confirmation. Yet large objects can be found almost anywhere, because every society has produced ceremonial displays, industrial equipment, theatrical props, and goods for unusually tall individuals. The tools are more difficult because their purpose may not be obvious to modern viewers. A heavy hammer, wrench, pair of tongs, drill, or cutting device can seem too large for a human operator. The immediate conclusion is that it required a much stronger and larger person. Industrial tools, however, were often used by teams. 2 or more workers could operate long-handled equipment together. A hammer might be lifted with assistance, swung from a pivot, or suspended from a flexible support. Large tongs could be handled from opposite ends. A wrench with a long lever allowed ordinary workers to apply more force, not because they were giants, but because leverage multiplied their effort. This point is important. A tool can be large precisely because the user is not exceptionally strong. A longer handle reduces the force needed to move a heavy object. A broad grip allows several people to hold the same tool. A large head may deliver more impact after being raised mechanically. Blacksmithing and foundry work produced many objects that look impossible to use by hand. Large hammers were attached to water wheels, steam engines, belts, or mechanical arms. Workers controlled the machine rather than lifting the hammer directly. If the support system is missing, the surviving hammerhead may be mistaken for a handheld tool. Railway workshops used enormous spanners and levers because the machinery itself was enormous. Shipyards handled bolts, chains, plates, and fittings far larger than household equivalents. Mines required drilling equipment, lifting devices, and pumps designed for heavy work. Agricultural tools could be pulled by horses or attached to carts. An object resembling a large knife may have been part of a machine. A broad blade might cut leather, tobacco, paper, cloth, food, or industrial material. A huge pair of scissors could be a bench-mounted shear. A long-handled axe might be ceremonial, theatrical, or used from a fixed position. Museums sometimes display only the removable component. The handle, frame, stand, cable, or machine that once supported it has been lost. A viewer then imagines someone carrying the object freely. The condition of the tool can reveal how it was used. Repeated wear on one side may show that it moved through a limited arc. Holes or attachment points may indicate a missing support. A polished section on the handle may reveal where hands gripped it. If the supposed grip area is too wide for any human hand but contains bolt holes, it was probably mounted rather than held. Supporters of the giant theory sometimes argue that mechanical explanations are added after the fact. They note that certain tools are displayed without machines, and that labels may simply call them hammers, axes, or wrenches. If a museum cannot demonstrate the original mechanism, they ask, why assume one existed? That is a reasonable question when the object lacks context. The answer should come from comparison. Industrial catalogues, workshop photographs, patents, trade manuals, and surviving machines often show how similar tools were mounted and operated. A strange object becomes less mysterious when an identical one appears in a factory illustration connected to a crane or pivot. 19th-century trade catalogues are especially useful. Manufacturers printed detailed drawings of equipment, listed dimensions, and described how many workers were required. These records can identify objects whose museum labels are vague. They also show how much heavy work ordinary people could perform with simple mechanical assistance. Strength itself is easy to underestimate. Workers who handled stone, timber, metal, cargo, and agricultural equipment developed considerable skill and physical ability. They did not need to be 8 feet tall to move large loads. Teams used rollers, sledges, block and tackle, ramps, jacks, counterweights, and animal power. The work was slow and dangerous, but it was possible. Some tools were designed for competitive or ceremonial strength displays. Large hammers, stones, clubs, and weights might be lifted during festivals, military demonstrations, or travelling shows. These objects tested exceptional individuals rather than serving ordinary labour. A performer able to raise a heavy weight could attract paying audiences. The tool remained real, but its purpose was entertainment. Weapons raise similar questions. Oversized swords, spears, axes, and firearms are sometimes presented as evidence of giant soldiers. A sword much longer than a normal blade seems to demand a taller warrior. Ceremonial weapons were often intentionally large. They were carried in processions, displayed in halls, placed beside thrones, or used as symbols of office. Executioners' swords could be broad and heavy because they were not used like battlefield weapons. Bearing swords represented civic authority and were carried by officials. Temple weapons could be offerings rather than practical arms. Parade weapons also needed to be visible to crowds. A large object had greater visual impact and could be seen from a distance. It did not need to be balanced for repeated combat. Some historical battlefield weapons were genuinely large. Two-handed swords, long spears, polearms, and heavy bows required training, but not giant bodies. Their size related to reach, formation tactics, armour, and the use of both hands. A 6-foot weapon does not require a 6-foot arm. The user controls it through leverage, stance, and movement. Firearms can be equally misleading. Large wall guns and punt guns were mounted on supports or boats. Heavy early firearms rested on stands. A photograph of the weapon without its mount makes it appear handheld. There are, however, weapons and tools whose exact purpose remains uncertain. Archaeological objects may survive without written records. A large iron implement could have several possible uses. Historians compare shape, wear, material, location, and similar finds. But certainty is not always possible. Uncertainty should not be hidden. Museums sometimes use labels such as possibly ceremonial or function unknown, because the evidence does not support a stronger claim. For advocates of alternative history, that uncertainty can look like an opportunity. If the institution does not know what the object was, perhaps it belonged to giants. The problem is that an unknown function does not favour one explanation over all others. It simply means the function is unknown. To connect it to a giant user, the object should contain features that match a giant body and cannot be better explained by mounting, teamwork, ceremony, or mechanical use. Machines form the broadest category because they are built around processes rather than human proportions. A machine can be enormous while its operator sits at an ordinary control panel. Boilers, presses, pumps, turbines, looms, engines, and generators grew rapidly during the 19th century. Their scale reflected production demands. Photographs of old factories often show workers standing beside wheels, gears, and shafts several times taller than themselves. To a modern viewer, the scene can appear as though small people inherited machines made for larger operators. Yet industrial systems routinely separate machine scale from operator scale. A modern aircraft is much larger than its pilot. A mining truck has wheels taller than a person. A cargo crane can lift hundreds of tons while one operator sits inside a compact cabin. Large scale does not tell us the body size of the user. Earlier machines were less automated, but the same principle applied. Workers controlled valves, levers, belts, and switches. The central mechanism handled forces beyond human strength. A large flywheel stored energy. A gear system multiplied torque. Steam pressure drove pistons. Water or animal power moved components. Control height is more informative than machine height. If levers, pedals, platforms, inspection windows and safety rails are positioned for ordinary adults, the machine was likely operated by ordinary adults. Supporters sometimes point to controls placed unusually high, but maintenance platforms, missing floors and later modifications must be considered. Factories changed constantly. Machines were moved, floors were removed, and platforms decayed. A lever now 7 feet above the floor may once have been beside a raised walkway. A wheel may have been operated with a chain hanging downward. A high valve could be reached with a rod. Photographs taken after abandonment are especially misleading because wooden stairs, belts, supports, and platforms often disappear before iron components. The surviving machine becomes an incomplete skeleton. Without the missing elements, its relationship to the worker is difficult to reconstruct. Large control rooms, desks, and consoles are occasionally described as giant workstations. Yet older control systems required many gauges and switches. Panels spread across walls because each function had a separate mechanical instrument. Operators walked along them or worked in teams. The size of the panel reflected the complexity of the system, not the height of the operator. Furniture found inside government and industrial buildings adds another layer. Large desks may have been shared by clerks, used to spread maps, or designed to hold ledgers. Library tables supported oversized books and plans. Drafting tables had broad surfaces because engineers and architects worked with large drawings. A tall desk could be used while standing. Standing desks existed long before modern offices rediscovered them. Writing slopes, counters, and lecterns were also taller than seated desks. A photograph showing a high surface does not necessarily indicate a giant clerk. Large cabinets stored maps, textiles, scientific specimens, weapons, legal documents, or printing plates. Their doors might extend above comfortable reach because ladders were expected. Libraries still use rolling ladders for the same reason. Storage scale reflects the volume of material, not the body of the archivist. Another group of objects often included in the theory consists of domestic utensils. Giant spoons, bowls, cups, and cookware appear in photographs and collections. These seem personal and therefore persuasive. Why would an ordinary household need a spoon the length of an arm? Large utensils usually served communal or industrial purposes. Kitchens in monasteries, military barracks, hospitals, ships, schools, and estates prepared food for hundreds of people. Pots were large because the meals were large. Long handles protected workers from heat. Broad paddles stirred thick mixtures. Ladles reached into deep containers. Breweries, dairies, bakeries, and food processing workshops used equipment that resembled household utensils at several times the size. A giant spoon might have stirred grain, dye, soap, wax, or chemicals rather than soup. Ceremonial vessels could also be oversized. Communities commissioned large cups, plates, and spoons to mark events or advertise local production. Decorative objects were sometimes made from materials that would not survive regular use. Their lack of wear can identify them as display pieces. Wear is one of the best tests for any supposed giant object. A practical item accumulates marks where the body contacts it. Chair arms become polished. Shoe soles compress. Tool handles smooth under repeated grip. Steps wear at the centre. Bed frames bend at stress points. Clothing stretches at elbows, knees and shoulders. If an oversized object shows no wear, it may never have been used. That does not make it fake. It changes its role from practical equipment to symbol, advertisement, model or ceremonial display. Repairs are equally valuable. Replaced joints, patches, reinforced handles and altered seams show long-term use. They can also reveal whether the object was adapted. A large chair with a later footrest may have been reused by smaller people. A coat reduced at the shoulders may have passed from a larger wearer to a smaller one. The theory of inheritance often uses these modifications as evidence that ordinary people took over objects made for giants. Sometimes that interpretation is possible. Objects are constantly adapted for new users. The challenge is proving the original user's size rather than assuming it from the later change. Suppose a large table has shorter legs added beneath an older frame. One explanation is that it was lowered for smaller occupants. Another is that the original legs rotted and were replaced badly. A third is that the table was converted from industrial to domestic use. Physical evidence may distinguish among these possibilities, but the modification alone does not. Museums contribute to the confusion because display choices separate related objects. A chair may be shown without the room it occupied. A hammer may be displayed without the machine. Clothing may hang without information about the wearer. The object becomes visually impressive but historically incomplete. Labels are often brief because exhibition space is limited. A museum may know more than the public text reveals. Collection databases, conservation reports, donor records, and unpublished catalogues can contain additional detail. Researchers who rely only on photographs of displays may conclude that the institution has no explanation. In other cases, the museum genuinely lacks information. Older collections were assembled under weaker standards. Donors provided objects with family stories that could not be verified. Items were moved between departments. Labels were lost during war, relocation, fire, or renovation. This creates a genuine problem for history. When context disappears, later interpretation becomes uncertain. It also makes deliberate erasure difficult to distinguish from ordinary neglect. The claim that institutions removed giant-related objects would be stronger if objects with clear documentation were shown to have vanished after officials recognized their significance. A missing chair or tool is less useful when its original identity was never established. Museums deaccession duplicates, damaged items, forgeries and objects outside their collection policies. Some are transferred or returned to communities. A change in classification can also look like disappearance. An object once labelled Giant's Hammer may later be identified as a railway tool and moved to an industrial collection. A large bone described in a local museum as human may be recognised as animal and transferred to natural history storage. The object remains, but the dramatic label is gone. Advocates may see that as reclassification designed to suppress evidence. Sometimes institutions have made biased or politically motivated decisions, so suspicion is not unreasonable. The way to test the claim is to compare the old and new records, examine the object and review the reasons for the change. If the revised identification is supported by measurements, material analysis, and comparison with known tools, then reclassification improves accuracy. If the object disappeared without documentation immediately after questions were raised, the case deserves more investigation. The objects discussed here therefore fall into several groups. Some were built for known tall individuals, some were ceremonial, some advertised businesses or exhibitions, some were operated by teams or machines, some belong to large-scale industries, others have lost their histories and remain uncertain. That mixture does not produce a simple answer. It confirms that unusually large objects existed across many societies. It also confirms that size alone cannot identify their users. For the giant class theory to become stronger, the objects would need to connect directly to the people in the photographs and the buildings already examined. A named individual should appear with a chair matching their measurements. The same person should be documented working in a building whose controls and furniture correspond to that scale. Tools attributed to their group should show grips, wear, and methods of use suited to larger bodies. Without those links, the evidence remains a collection of large things from unrelated contexts. The connection may feel clear when the images are placed side by side, but visual similarity is not the same as shared origin. The most serious evidence claimed by the theory does not depend on an interpretation of furniture or machinery. It comes from reports that human bones of extraordinary size were removed from burial mounds, caves, construction sites, and ancient ruins. Unlike a ceremonial chair, a skeleton directly records the body that once existed. If those reports are accurate and the remains can be verified, they would change the entire discussion. That is why old newspaper archives have become central to the subject. Page after page contains stories of workers uncovering enormous skulls, unusually long femurs, double rows of teeth, and complete skeletons said to measure 8, 9, or 12 feet. Some reports name doctors and local officials. Others claim that the remains were packed into crates and sent to major museums, where their trail becomes much harder to follow. Those newspaper reports are often treated as the strongest evidence in the entire argument, because bones are different from buildings, photographs, or furniture. A large doorway can have several purposes. An oversized chair may be ceremonial. A tall figure in an old portrait may be standing closer to the camera. A human skeleton, however, belongs to a human body. If complete remains measuring 9, 10, or 12 feet were genuinely discovered, carefully examined and then removed from public view, the question would become much harder to dismiss. Across 19th century and early 20th century newspapers, readers can find stories describing unusual remains uncovered in burial mounds, caves, fields, riverbanks, and construction sites. Labourers dig a foundation and strike a stone chamber. Farmers level a mound and uncover a large skull. Railway workers cut through a hillside and expose rows of bones. The skeleton is described as enormous, sometimes with a jaw large enough to fit over the face of the person holding it. A doctor, professor, or local official may be called to the site. The remains are measured, photographed, or packed into crates. Then, quite often, the article ends before explaining what happened next. That missing ending has become central to the theory. Some accounts claim that the bones were sent to a university. Others mention a state museum, a historical society, or the Smithsonian Institution. Later researchers search public catalogues and cannot find the remains. The absence is interpreted as evidence that the discovery was hidden, destroyed, or placed in storage under a different classification. It is an understandable suspicion. If a newspaper says that an 8-foot skeleton was shipped to an institution, and the institution now says it has no record of the object, something appears to be missing. Yet before deciding that the bones were deliberately erased, we have to examine how these stories were produced, how remains were handled, and what the measurements actually meant. Newspapers of the period were not written as archaeological reports. Many were small local businesses competing for attention. An unusual discovery could fill a column, attract readers, and give the town a brief moment of importance. Editors copied stories from other papers, sometimes shortening them, changing details, or adding a more dramatic headline. A report printed in Ohio might be repeated in Pennsylvania, New York, and California. By the time it travelled across the country, the location could shift. The skeleton could gain several inches, and an uncertain observation might become a confident fact. The original article might say that the burial was believed to contain a very tall person. A later version might announce the discovery of an ancient race of giants. This did not require a coordinated hoax. It was the normal movement of news before recordings, digital archives, and instant corrections. A printer received a story, selected the most interesting details, and published it for readers who had little chance of checking the original site. If the account turned out to be mistaken, the correction rarely travelled as far as the exciting first report. Headlines created their own distortions. A phrase such as giant skeleton found did not always mean a skeleton belonging to a biological giant. Giant could simply mean large, impressive, ancient, or surprising. The body might have been 6 feet 2 inches tall, in a population where the average male height was considerably lower. To the local witnesses, that person may genuinely have seemed enormous. Measurements also varied in quality. Modern archaeologists estimate height using established formulas based on long bones, body proportions, sex, population, and skeletal condition. An amateur excavator in 1875 might lay the bones on the ground, place the skull several inches above the spine, leave gaps between the joints, and measure from the top of the skull to the lowest foot bone. A skeleton is not held together after soft tissue disappears. Bones shift, separate, and become scattered. If someone arranges them with extra space between the joints, the reconstructed body can grow significantly. A person who stood 6 feet 6 inches in life might be displayed as 7 feet 6 inches or more. Burial length was another source of confusion. An 8-foot grave does not require an 8-foot occupant. Graves are usually longer than the bodies placed inside them. Stone chambers and burial boxes may contain offerings, tools, pottery, or empty space. A newspaper reporter arriving after the remains had been moved might hear that the grave was 9 feet long, and report that the skeleton was 9 feet tall. Some stories were based on partial remains. A large femur, jaw, or skull fragment was discovered and used to estimate the full body. Without proper identification, human bones could be confused with those of large animals. Mastodon, mammoth, bear, whale, and other remains have all been mistaken for giant human bones at various points in history. A fragment from a large animal can look surprisingly human to someone without anatomical training. A joint may resemble a knee. A broken section of skull may look like part of a human cranium. Once the possibility of a giant is suggested, witnesses may begin arranging every object around that idea. Even trained observers have made mistakes when working with incomplete material. Early archaeology and physical anthropology were developing fields. Standards varied, and many excavations were carried out by collectors, physicians, landowners, military officers, or local enthusiasts rather than specialists. The word professor in a newspaper article does not always solve the problem. It might refer to a school teacher, lecturer, travelling expert, or self-appointed authority. Academic titles were sometimes used loosely, especially when a story needed a respectable witness. A named doctor could confirm that bones were human without being qualified to estimate height from a damaged skeleton. There were genuine medical giants, of course. Human beings above 7 feet have existed throughout recorded history, and a few approached or exceeded 8 feet. Their remains would be unusual but not impossible. If a very tall person lived in an earlier community, the discovery of that person's skeleton would not require a lost civilization. The larger claim depends on frequency. One exceptionally tall skeleton would be a rare individual. Hundreds of verified skeletons of similar size found in organised cemeteries and associated with a consistent culture would suggest something more significant. This is why the original excavation context matters. Were the remains found alone or among many burials? Did the surrounding skeletons share the same unusual proportions? Were there tools, clothing, architecture, or inscriptions connected to them? Was the site professionally documented before it was disturbed? Many newspaper reports do not provide those details. A mound may contain several ordinary skeletons and one described as large. Another story may mention an entire group, but give measurements for only one body. Some accounts use phrases such as men of gigantic stature, without stating any actual height. Supporters often collect dozens or hundreds of these reports and argue that the volume itself proves a pattern. The number is certainly worth examining, but repetition does not make every report independent. Several articles may trace back to one original story. A report may be reprinted years later as though it were a new discovery. Different headlines may describe the same site. A reliable catalogue would need to identify each unique event, find the earliest version, compare later retellings, and determine whether any physical evidence survives. Without that work, one discovery can become 10 newspaper clippings, and 10 clippings can look like 10 discoveries. A particularly common detail is the claim that the skeleton had 2 rows of teeth. This feature appears so frequently in giant reports that it has become almost part of the expected description. The phrase is often interpreted to mean 2 complete, functional sets of teeth arranged one behind the other, like a shark. Human dental anatomy can produce less dramatic appearances. Some people have extra teeth, a condition known as hypodontia. Permanent teeth may erupt before baby teeth have fallen out, creating a temporary double row. Crowded teeth can overlap. A damaged jaw with exposed tooth sockets may be described incorrectly. Old writers also used double teeth to mean molars, which are broader than the teeth at the front. The language can therefore change the picture. A double row of teeth may sound like an unknown species when the writer meant that the person had large molars or an unusual pattern of crowding. Without the actual jaw, the phrase cannot be tested. Another repeated claim concerns enormous skulls. Photographs sometimes show people holding skulls that appear much larger than ordinary human heads. Some are genuine pathological specimens. Hydrocephalus and other conditions can enlarge the skull. Some photographs show reconstructions, replicas, or animal remains. Others use perspective, with the skull held closer to the camera. A large skull does not necessarily belong to a proportionally tall body. Human conditions can affect one part of the skeleton more than another. Acromegaly can enlarge the jaw, hands, feet, and facial bones. Gigantism, caused by excessive growth hormone before the growth plates close, can produce extreme height. These conditions leave recognizable skeletal changes. If museums possessed complete giant skeletons, specialists could examine the bones for those features. They could estimate stature, age, sex, disease, diet, and ancestry. DNA analysis might reveal relationships to nearby populations. Isotopes could show where the person grew up and what they ate. The absence of accessible specimens is therefore frustrating. Newspaper words cannot replace the bones themselves. Why did so many remains apparently disappear after discovery? Part of the answer lies in the poor treatment of archaeological material during that period. Bones were removed without detailed records, stored in unsuitable conditions, mixed with other collections damaged, discarded, or privately sold. Labels separated from objects, institutions moved to new buildings. Fires, floods, insects, moisture, war, and simple neglect destroyed material. A crate arriving at a museum might contain bones identified only by a town name and an approximate date. Decades later, staff reorganizing the collection might be unable to connect it to the newspaper story. The remains could be listed under an accession number rather than the dramatic description used by the press. Reclassification can also make an object appear to vanish. A supposed giant femur may be identified as animal. A complete skeleton may be remeasured and found to belong to a person of ordinary or moderately tall stature. Once the original claim is rejected, the catalogue may no longer use the word giant. To someone searching only for that term, the specimen has disappeared. In reality, it may still exist under a different identification. Institutions have sometimes disposed of human remains, especially when they lacked documentation or were considered unsuitable for research. Historical collecting practices were often careless and unethical. Museums accumulated thousands of indigenous remains, frequently taken without consent from graves and sacred sites. Many are now being returned to descendant communities. This history creates a difficult situation. Researchers asking to inspect remains for giant evidence may encounter restrictions, incomplete records, or repatriation processes. Those limits can be interpreted as secrecy, but they may reflect legal and ethical responsibilities to the dead and their communities. The Smithsonian Institution is mentioned repeatedly in alternative accounts. It is often described as the organization that received giant skeletons and then concealed them. Some versions claim that officials destroyed bones to protect a preferred history of North America. The allegation usually relies on newspaper statements saying that remains were sent to the Smithsonian, followed by the modern absence of a publicly identified giant specimen. Yet a newspaper claiming that an object was going to be sent is not proof that it arrived. Local discoverers may have intended to ship it and never did. The institution may have declined it. The package may have contained ordinary or animal bones. The story may simply have used the name of a famous institution to sound more credible. There are also fabricated documents and satirical stories that have been repeated as evidence. A false report can acquire authority when it resembles an official notice or court decision. Once copied across websites, the origin becomes difficult to trace, and each repetition makes the claim appear more established. None of this proves that every institutional record is complete or honest. Museums and academic organizations have hidden mistakes, protected reputations, and participated in political projects. Historical institutions are run by people, and people can be defensive, careless, ambitious, or occasionally fond of putting an awkward object in a basement and hoping no one asks about it. A claim of systematic destruction, however, requires evidence of the destruction itself. We would look for orders, correspondence, disposal records, testimony from staff, photographs before and after removal, or surviving fragments linked to the alleged specimens. So far, the popular version of the story relies more heavily on gaps than on direct documentation of a coordinated policy. The mound discoveries are closely connected to another 19th century belief, the idea that indigenous peoples could not have built the large earthworks found across North America. Settlers and early writers often attributed the mounds to a vanished race separate from the native populations they encountered. This belief served a political purpose. If the land had once belonged to a mysterious lost people, rather than the ancestors of living indigenous communities, settlers could present themselves as the latest occupants in a cycle of replacement. The achievements represented by the mounds were separated from the people whose histories and traditions connected them to those sites. Stories of giants fit easily into that framework. A powerful ancient race had built the earthworks, disappeared, and left the land available to others. Some newspapers combined giant skeletons with descriptions of advanced metalwork, unusual writing, or lost cities. Later archaeological research connected the mounds to diverse indigenous cultures with long histories in the regions where the earthworks were built. The older idea of a separate mound-building race lost academic support. As that interpretation changed, giant stories associated with it also became less common. Advocates of the erasure theory see this decline as suppression. Another explanation is that archaeology became more systematic and stopped treating every unusual report as evidence of a vanished race. Measurements improved. Sites were documented more carefully. Human and animal remains were distinguished more reliably. The timing matters. Giant reports did not vanish at one exact moment. Sensational stories continued well into the 20th century and still appear today. What changed was their credibility within professional archaeology. Newspapers could continue printing them, but academic institutions increasingly demanded physical specimens, excavation records, and repeatable measurements. That shift may feel like a narrowing of acceptable possibilities, and in some cases professional gatekeeping did reject unconventional evidence too quickly. Science is not free from fashion or authority, yet requiring a bone to exist before rewriting human history is a fairly reasonable inconvenience. Hoaxes also made investigators more cautious. The Cardiff giant demonstrated how profitable a manufactured discovery could become. In 1869, workers in New York uncovered what appeared to be a petrified giant. Crowds paid to see it. Arguments broke out over whether it was a fossilized human, an ancient statue, or something else entirely. The figure had actually been carved from gypsum and buried deliberately. Its creator intended to fool the public and make money from the resulting excitement. Even after doubts were raised, people continued paying to see it. A copy was produced, and competing exhibitions argued over which giant was authentic, which is a particularly efficient way to turn one fake giant into two sources of admission fees. Other fraudulent remains were assembled from animal bones, plaster, or pieces taken from multiple skeletons. Travelling displays could advertise a giant mummy without allowing independent examination. By the time experts exposed the fraud, the exhibition had moved on. This commercial history does not invalidate every report, but it changes the standard of proof. Extraordinary remains attracted money, attention, and local fame. Those incentives encouraged exaggeration. There is also the problem of estimating past human height from limited samples. Nutrition strongly affects growth. Communities with reliable food, lower disease burdens, and favourable genetics can produce individuals taller than neighbouring populations. A burial containing several people over 6 feet might seem remarkable in a period when many adults were shorter. Armour, doorways, and beds are sometimes used to argue that people in the past were much larger or much smaller than modern humans. In reality, average height has changed across periods and regions, but variation within populations has always been substantial. A tall individual does not sit outside ordinary humanity simply because most neighbours were shorter. What would convincing evidence of a historical giant population look like? First, the remains would need to be physically available for independent study. Complete skeletons would be far more useful than isolated bones. The excavation location and surrounding context would have to be documented. Measurements would need to be taken by qualified specialists using accepted methods. The remains should show consistent proportions. A person described as 10 feet tall should have long bones matching that stature, not an ordinary skeleton stretched across a long display. The joints, spine, skull, hands, and feet should belong to the same individual. Dating would establish when the person lived. DNA could test whether several unusually tall individuals were related or formed a distinct population. Evidence of diet and disease might explain their growth. Burials could reveal whether they held special social positions through clothing, grave goods, location, or treatment after death. A cemetery containing many individuals of exceptional stature would be far more significant than one isolated burial. If the theory of an administrative or guardian class were correct, those individuals might be buried near government centres, fortifications, construction sites, or major public buildings. Their graves might contain insignia, specialised tools, or records of office. Most of the popular evidence does not reach that level. It consists of articles describing remains that can no longer be located, photographs without scale, and stories repeated long after the excavation. There are occasional archaeological discoveries of very tall individuals, and each deserves proper study. A man estimated at 7 feet or more in an ancient cemetery is unusual and historically interesting. It may reveal disease, status, migration, or genetic inheritance. It does not become meaningless because it fails to reach 10 feet. The search for giants can sometimes cause genuine discoveries to be overlooked. Researchers may become so focused on proving a hidden race that they ignore what an individual skeleton can tell us about real human life. A tall person in an ancient community may have been respected, feared, disabled, protected, exploited, or assigned a special role. The burial context could answer those questions. Those possibilities connect with the photographs examined earlier. Extremely tall humans did exist, and societies responded to them in different ways. Some became guards or performers. Others lived less visible lives. Their skeletons may survive in archaeological collections, though classified under medical or ordinary human categories rather than as giants. This may explain part of the apparent disappearance. The people did not vanish from science. The language used to describe them changed. Giant became a term associated with folklore and entertainment. Researchers used more specific descriptions such as estimated stature, pituitary gigantism, acromegaly, or skeletal pathology. To supporters, this sounds like reclassification designed to make the evidence seem less dramatic. From a scientific perspective, it provides more information. Calling a person a giant describes an impression. Identifying the biological process explains how the body developed. That explanation does not address claims of entire populations above 8 feet, because no verified skeletal collection has established such a group. It does, however, account for individual people who would have appeared giant beside their neighbours. The newspaper reports remain valuable historical sources, but not always for the reason claimed. They show what communities believed, what editors considered exciting, how discoveries were handled, and how ideas about race, ancient history, and human difference circulated. They also preserve leads that may point to real sites and lost collections. Each report should be approached as the beginning of an investigation rather than the final proof. The names can be checked. The location can be identified. Later papers may contain corrections. Museum catalogues may record a shipment. Archaeological surveys may describe the same mound. Family papers may reveal who found the bones. Some cases will collapse under examination. The skeleton becomes an animal. The measurement becomes a grave length. Or the story becomes a reprint of a known hoax. Other cases may remain unresolved because the evidence was genuinely lost. A few could lead to authentic remains belonging to unusually tall individuals. An unresolved case is not proof of a giant civilization, but neither is it a reason to stop looking. Historical records are full of missing objects and incomplete investigations. The careful position is to keep the uncertainty attached to the specific case, rather than using it to confirm a much larger theory. The claim becomes broader when these burial stories are connected to Tartaria. The argument proposes that the skeletons belong to the same tall class seen in 19th century photographs and reflected in oversized architecture. Their remains were removed at the same time that Tartaria disappeared from maps and public education. For that connection to hold, the dates and locations should align. Giant remains should appear most frequently within regions once labelled Tartary, or in areas supposedly influenced by its civilization. Burial customs, artifacts, and skeletal features should show relationships across those territories. Newspaper stories from North America, European palace architecture, Russian maps, and Asian regional names are often brought together, but a direct archaeological link between them is rarely demonstrated. The pieces are joined by interpretation rather than by shared inscriptions, materials, DNA, or documented institutions. The next part of the investigation therefore requires us to examine the name at the centre of the claim. Tartary appears clearly on old maps. It is not an invented word, and it was not limited to one obscure document. European geographers used it for centuries across an enormous portion of Asia. The real question is what those map makers meant by it. Was Tartaria a unified state with its own government, technology, and social classes? Or was it a broad external label applied to many different peoples and territories? Understanding that difference is necessary before the tall figures, the large buildings, and the reports from beneath the earth can be connected to the civilization they are said to have served. The name at the centre of the theory is not imaginary. Tartary, Tartaria, Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Muscovite Tartary can all be found on genuine historical maps. The labels appear across large sections of northern, central and eastern Asia, sometimes covering territory that would now include parts of Russia, Mongolia, China, Kazakhstan, and several neighbouring regions. To someone seeing one of these maps for the first time, the conclusion can seem obvious. There is Tartaria, printed in large letters across a vast area. It looks like the name of a country. It occupies more space than many European kingdoms. Then, on later maps, the name becomes smaller, breaks into regional labels and eventually disappears. Where did it go? Supporters of the lost civilization theory argue that Tartaria was a major political power whose history was gradually divided among the states that inherited its territory. According to this view, its buildings, transportation systems, energy technologies, and administrative structures were absorbed by newer governments. Its name was removed from maps because acknowledging Tartaria would raise uncomfortable questions about who constructed the cities and monuments later claimed by Russia, China, European empires, and the United States. The unusually tall people discussed earlier are sometimes placed within this civilization as guards, engineers, officials, or members of a ruling class. Large buildings become Tartarian institutions. Oversized tools become Tartarian industrial equipment. Giant skeleton reports become evidence of the people who built and governed the system. It is an attractive explanation because the map supplies a name for everything else. Without Tartaria, the photographs, doors, chairs, machines, and skeleton reports remain disconnected mysteries. With Tartaria, they become pieces of one lost world. Before accepting that connection, we need to understand how historical maps were made and what map labels meant to the people who printed them. Modern maps encourage us to think in terms of clearly defined states. A country has a border, a government, a capital, and an official name. Different colours separate one political unit from another. When a large label appears across a territory, we usually assume it identifies the state controlling that land. Older European maps did not always work that way. They combined political boundaries, geographical regions, ethnic labels, trade routes, religious categories, rumours, and information copied from earlier mapmakers. A name could refer to a kingdom, a collection of peoples, an unfamiliar region, or simply a large area that outsiders did not understand in detail. The word Tartary was one of those broad labels. European writers used variations of Tatar and Tartar for numerous peoples across Eurasia. The terms were applied inconsistently to Mongols, Turkic groups, nomadic confederations, and communities living under different rulers. The people being described did not necessarily call themselves Tartarians or regard themselves as members of one unified nation. The added letter R in Tartar became common in Europe and may have been encouraged by an association with Tartarus, the underworld from Greek mythology. Mongol invasions had created enormous fear, and Europeans sometimes described the invaders in language suggesting they had emerged from somewhere rather unpleasant. Medieval public relations could be quite dramatic, especially when an army had recently arrived without an invitation. Over time, the label remained useful to outsiders. European geographers knew that a vast collection of peoples and territories existed beyond the better mapped parts of Eastern Europe, Persia, India, and China. Their information was incomplete, so they placed broad regional names over the gaps. This does not mean the area was empty or primitive. It contained cities, trade networks, states, khanates, empires, religious centres, and sophisticated cultures. The problem was not an absence of civilization. It was the limited knowledge of the mapmakers producing documents for European audiences. A map printed in Amsterdam, Paris, or London could combine travellers' accounts, diplomatic reports, military information, older maps, and educated guesswork. Regions close to major trade routes might be shown in detail. Areas farther away could be represented with uncertain rivers, misplaced mountains, and labels covering thousands of kilometres. The size of a printed name therefore does not measure the unity or power of the territory beneath it. Large letters were often used because the region itself was large, and the cartographer had little more specific information to place there. This becomes clearer when different maps are compared. Tartary does not have one consistent border. On one map, it may extend toward the Pacific. On another, it overlaps territories associated with China. Some divide it into several Tartaries. Others use the term alongside names such as Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, or the Russian Empire. A unified state normally leaves signs of consistent political identity. Borders change, but administrative centres, rulers, diplomatic relations, taxation systems, laws, military structures, coinage, and official documents usually provide evidence of the state's existence. The larger and more powerful the state, the more records it tends to create. The Tartarian Empire proposed in modern alternative history would have covered an enormous and culturally varied territory. Governing such a space would require communication systems, provincial authorities, military organisation, and agreements with neighbouring powers. Rival states would mention it in treaties, intelligence reports, trade records, and diplomatic correspondence. Instead, historical documents describe many different political entities across the area labelled Tartary. There were khanates, tribal confederations, imperial provinces, nomadic territories, and regions contested by Russia, China, Persia, and other powers. They formed alliances, fought wars, collected taxes, and controlled trade routes, but they did not operate as one continuous Tartarian government. This distinction is important because saying that Tartaria was not a single global empire does not mean nothing existed there. The land was not waiting politely for European cartographers to give it a name. It was occupied by real societies with their own languages, histories, and political identities. In fact, reducing all of them to a single lost Tartarian civilization can repeat the same mistake made by older European maps. It places one broad label over many different peoples and treats their differences as minor details. Supporters may answer that the records of the central government were destroyed or reassigned. Local rulers could have been described as independent even though they belonged to a larger structure. The empire may have operated as a federation rather than a tightly controlled state. That possibility would still require evidence connecting the parts. Shared laws, symbols, official titles, construction standards, writing systems, or financial records should appear across the territory. A federation leaves agreements between its members. A common administration produces common procedures. The architectural evidence presented for Tartaria does not show one consistent style. Buildings called Tartarian may be classical, Gothic, Islamic, Baroque, Neoclassical, Byzantine, Russian Revival, or influenced by local traditions. Some were built centuries apart. Some used stone, others brick, timber, iron, or plaster. Their main shared feature is often that they look impressive. Impressive architecture can appear across unrelated civilizations because political and religious institutions tend to favour size, symmetry, durable materials, and decoration. Columns do not prove that every building with columns belonged to the same empire. Domes travelled between cultures through trade, conquest, religious influence, and architectural fashion. Construction techniques also spread. Engineers studied foreign buildings. Craftspeople moved between cities. Governments hired architects from abroad. Pattern books allowed designs to be copied across continents. A railway station in one country might resemble a government office in another, without either belonging to a hidden state. The world of the 19th century was highly connected. Steamships, railways, telegraphs, newspapers, universities, military academies, and international exhibitions moved ideas quickly. Architects borrowed freely, occasionally with great admiration and occasionally with the confidence of someone hoping no one would notice. Some Tartaria theories focus on star-shaped forts. These geometric defensive structures appear in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Their repeated form is presented as evidence of a shared civilization. Star forts developed in response to gunpowder artillery. Angled walls allowed defenders to cover the approaches without leaving blind spots. Low, thick fortifications resisted cannon fire better than tall medieval walls. Military engineers across rival states adopted similar solutions because they faced similar weapons. The shape reflects mathematics and battlefield requirements. It does not require one global builder. Independent armies can reach the same design when cannonballs keep making the same point with unusual persistence. Domed government buildings and large exhibition halls are treated in a similar way. Their size and ornaments seem too advanced for the populations officially credited with constructing them. Yet many have surviving plans, contracts, photographs, budgets, and named architects. Labourers and suppliers appear in local records. Not every document is complete, and some official histories simplify the process. A building may have replaced an earlier structure or reused older foundations. Its opening date may be confused with its construction date. Political leaders may claim more credit than they deserve. None of that automatically transfers the building to Tartaria. The map question remains the strongest part of the claim because the name genuinely disappears. If it was used for centuries, why did cartographers stop using it? The most direct answer is that maps became more specific. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, European knowledge of Eurasia expanded through exploration, military campaigns, scientific expeditions, diplomacy, trade, and imperial administration. Russian authorities surveyed Siberia and territories farther east. Chinese imperial geography became better known to European scholars. Borders between empires and regional states were recorded more precisely. As information increased, the broad term Tartary became less useful. Mapmakers replaced it with names identifying particular regions and political units. Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, Turkestan, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire and other labels occupied spaces previously grouped under one vague heading. This was not an overnight removal. Different publishers stopped using the term at different times. Older terminology survived in books even after newer maps adopted more precise names. The change was gradual, uneven, and visible across editions. A planned erasure would be expected to produce a sharper break. Maps before a certain date would show Tartaria, while maps after an official decision would remove it consistently. Instead, the label fades as geographical classification changes. That gradual transition is less dramatic, but it matches the ordinary development of cartography. Large regional terms often disappear when political and geographical knowledge becomes more detailed. Similar changes occurred elsewhere. Europeans once used broad labels for parts of Africa, the Americas and the Pacific that later broke into more specific territories. Some names changed because empires expanded. Others changed because colonial governments imposed new borders. Still others changed when scholars adopted local terms or corrected earlier mistakes. A disappearing map label can reflect conquest, but it can also reflect improved knowledge or changing language. To determine which occurred, the maps must be compared with political records from the same period. The transformation of northern and central Asia was certainly shaped by conquest. The Russian Empire expanded across Siberia and into Central Asia. The Qing Empire controlled large areas once described by Europeans as Chinese Tartary. Khanates were defeated, absorbed, or placed under new political arrangements. Borders changed through war, treaty, and colonization. Real states and communities did lose independence. Their histories were often rewritten from the perspective of the empires that conquered them. Languages and local identities were suppressed in some regions. Administrative categories replaced older political relationships. This history provides genuine examples of erasure. but it is not the same as the removal of one unified technological civilization. The evidence points to many societies being incorporated into expanding empires, rather than one state disappearing everywhere at once. The confusion is increased by encyclopedias and geographical dictionaries that list Tartary as a country or region. Older English did not always use the word country in the strict modern sense. It could mean a land, territory, or broad geographical area rather than a sovereign state. A description of Tartary as an extensive country inhabited by different peoples may therefore support the regional interpretation rather than the imperial one. The same text may go on to divide it among several rulers. Quotations shared online are often shortened before that explanation appears. One sentence identifies Tartary as vast and powerful. The surrounding paragraphs describe its internal divisions, uncertain boundaries, and different populations. Removing the context makes the description sound more definite than it was. Flags and coats of arms attributed to Tartaria create another line of argument. Historical books sometimes include a flag labelled Tartarian, often featuring a dragon or another striking symbol. This is presented as proof of national identity. Flag books were not always reliable records of sovereign states. They included merchant ensigns, regional symbols, imagined flags, naval signals, and designs copied from earlier publications. A flag associated with a ruler or port could later be interpreted as the national banner of an enormous empire. A genuine flag does not by itself establish the size or structure of the state using it. Small kingdoms, military units, trading companies, and individual rulers all used flags. The identity of the people who carried the design must be established through independent records. Coins present a similar challenge. Images of unusual coins are sometimes labelled Tartarian because they contain unfamiliar symbols or were found within regions once marked as Tartary. Coins can reveal rulers, languages, trade networks, and religious traditions, but they need to be read accurately. A coin minted by a known Khanate is evidence of the Khanate, not automatically of a larger hidden empire. The same applies to writing. Central and Northern Asia contain numerous scripts and languages: Arabic, Persian, Mongolian, Turkic, Chinese, Tibetan, Russian, and local writing traditions appeared across the region. A continent-wide administration would likely leave some common bureaucratic language or standardized record system. Instead, the documentary landscape reflects the political and cultural variety already described by conventional history. The giant connection is even harder to establish. Populations across Eurasia differed in average height, but no reliable body of evidence shows a class of 8 to 10-foot administrators governing the territories marked Tartary. No consistent uniform, title, legal category, or burial practice identifies such a group. Tall guards and performers photographed in the 19th century can be traced to different countries and institutions. Joining them to Tartaria requires assuming the connection first and then treating their height as confirmation. A better test would begin with Tartarian records, identify a named office held by unusually tall individuals, and then connect those records to photographs or remains. Without that sequence, the theory moves backward from unusual images to a civilization broad enough to contain them. Why, then, has the idea become so popular? Part of the appeal comes from real frustration with simplified history. School books often compress vast regions into a few paragraphs. Civilizations outside Western Europe may appear briefly, usually when they invade, trade with, or are conquered by better-known states. Local histories disappear beneath national narratives. Tartary is a perfect symbol of that loss, because the word is visible on maps, but unfamiliar to most people. Finding it can feel like discovering something deliberately withheld. The grand buildings strengthen that feeling. Many modern visitors have little experience with stone construction, manual engineering, or 19th century industry. Official timelines can sound implausible when reduced to a plaque stating that an enormous building was completed in 3 years. Photographs of muddy streets beside elaborate architecture make the contrast sharper. The people look poor, the roads look unfinished. The building looks ancient and advanced. The idea that they inherited it can seem more natural than the claim that they built it. Yet societies often direct enormous resources toward public monuments, while ordinary living conditions remain poor. Governments build palaces during famines, cathedrals beside crowded housing, and railway stations before improving local streets. Political prestige does not wait for practical priorities to be completed. It usually arrives first and sends the bill later. Another source of appeal is the condition of modern cities. Beautiful historic buildings are demolished, neglected, or replaced by cheaper structures. It can be difficult to believe that earlier societies created elaborate stonework while modern construction often produces plain glass and concrete. The change is economic rather than biological. Hand labour was once cheaper, building regulations differed, and public monuments were expected to last for generations. Modern developers value speed, internal floor area, energy performance, and cost. Decorative stone carving is possible today, but few clients are eager to pay for several hundred stone faces watching pedestrians from a cornice. The Tartarian explanation also offers a clear villain. Governments, museums, and universities become responsible for hiding a better world. This turns confusion into intention. Missing records are no longer accidental. Demolished buildings are no longer the result of development, war, or neglect. Every gap becomes part of a planned transition. Real institutions deserve criticism. Museums have taken sacred objects and human remains. Governments have destroyed archives. Empires have rewritten local histories. Universities have excluded evidence that did not fit dominant beliefs. Historical authority should never be accepted without examination. The risk appears when suspicion becomes unfalsifiable. If an object exists, it proves Tartaria. Proves. If it is missing, its absence proves suppression. If experts identify it, they are protecting the official story. If they cannot identify it, their uncertainty proves the theory. Every possible result leads to the same conclusion. A useful theory must allow evidence to count against it. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to test. The historical Tartary found on maps is still worth studying. It points toward a part of the world whose complexity was poorly represented by European cartographers. It invites questions about Mongol successor states, Siberian peoples, Central Asian Khanates, trade routes, imperial expansion, and the way outsiders create names for unfamiliar regions. Those histories are not less interesting than a hidden empire. They contain conquest, diplomacy, migration, rebellion, commerce, religion, and cultural exchange across distances that challenged every government attempting to control them. There was also real historical disappearance. Some communities were absorbed. Cities declined when trade routes shifted. Languages lost official status. Archives were destroyed during wars and revolutions. Political borders separated related peoples. Imperial histories minimized those who resisted expansion. What fades from a map is not always what fades from human memory. A cartographer may replace one label while families continue using older names, telling local stories, and preserving identities ignored by the state. By the beginning of the 20th century, the geographical term Tartary had largely fallen out of common Western use. The Russian Empire, Qing territories, Mongolia, and Central Asian regions were represented through more specific political labels. Universities standardized geographical terminology. Museums organized collections according to newer ethnic and national categories. Newspapers adopted the language of modern states. At roughly the same time, the public treatment of giant reports also changed. Photography became less associated with travelling curiosities and more regulated by journalism and identification records. Archaeology became professionalised. Medical explanations for extreme height became more precise. Museum catalogues were reorganised. Large exhibition buildings were demolished or assigned new histories after wars and revolutions. Seen from a distance, these changes can look coordinated. the maps lose Tartaria. Newspaper giants become less common. Oversized objects receive industrial explanations. Buildings are credited to modern architects. Skeletons move into restricted collections or disappear from public display. The pattern is the foundation of the next part of the theory. It argues that between about 1850 and 1920, evidence was not removed in one dramatic operation, but gradually filtered out of public life. Names changed, objects were relabeled, photographs were detached from their subjects, and institutions established a historical account that left no place for a tall administrative class or an inherited Tartarian civilization. To examine that claim fairly, we need to follow the timeline closely. We have to ask whether the disappearances happened together, whether records show deliberate coordination, and whether the same period can be explained by the rapid development of modern states, museums, science, photography, and mass education. The question is no longer simply why Tartaria left the maps. It is whether many different forms of evidence were narrowing at the same time, and who, if anyone, was guiding the process. The period between roughly 1850 and 1920 is central to the theory, because so many changes happened at the same time. Old geographical labels disappeared from common maps. Archaeology became more controlled by universities and government institutions. Museums expanded their collections and reorganized the objects already in storage. Photography moved from a specialized process into ordinary public life. Medical science developed new terms for unusual bodies. National education systems produced standard versions of history for millions of students. Supporters of the theory argue that this was the window in which an older world was removed from public memory. They do not usually describe one single event in which officials gathered every photograph, skeleton, map, and oversized chair into a warehouse. The proposed process is quieter. A museum changes a label. A newspaper stops repeating a certain kind of story. A building receives a new construction date. A broad name on a map is replaced by a national border. A tall person once described as part of a distinct group becomes a patient with an individual disorder. After several generations, the pieces no longer appear to belong together. The idea is difficult to test because gradual changes leave no obvious starting point. There is no accepted date on which Tartaria supposedly ended and a replacement history began. The theory instead points to a concentration of institutional activity during these 70 years and asks whether the timing is accidental. It was certainly a period of extraordinary reorganization. Empires expanded, weakened, or collapsed. Railways connected territories that had previously required weeks or months of travel. Telegraph systems allowed governments to communicate across great distances. Census offices counted populations more systematically. Police departments developed identification records. Schools adopted standard textbooks. Museums classified human remains, tools, clothing, animals, and archaeological objects according to systems created by professional scholars. The modern state became much more capable of recording people and controlling the information attached to them. A tall person living in 1820 might be known through local stories, a church register, and perhaps a travelling exhibition poster. A similarly tall person living in 1910 could be photographed, measured by doctors, entered into census records, and described in medical journals. The body had not necessarily changed, but the system used to explain the body had. That change in language is one of the clearest reasons the apparent giants seem to disappear. Earlier newspapers and advertisements used the word giant freely. A person of exceptional height could be promoted as a giant without any medical explanation. The term was direct, memorable, and commercially useful. It told an audience what to expect and did not require a lecture about the pituitary gland before selling a ticket. As endocrinology developed, doctors began to distinguish between different causes of unusual growth. Gigantism was associated with excessive growth hormone beginning before adulthood. Acromegaly described related changes occurring after the growth plates had closed. Physicians recorded enlarged hands, feet, jaws, and facial features. They studied headaches, vision problems, joint pain, and organ enlargement. A person who might once have been presented only as a giant could now be described as having a medical condition. The public category narrowed into a clinical one. Supporters interpret this as a convenient form of reclassification. If every unusually tall person was treated as an isolated patient, then no one would ask whether the individuals belonged to a wider social group. A possible population became a collection of unrelated cases. There is some truth in the observation that classification changes perception. Once a label becomes medical, attention moves towards symptoms and away from cultural role. A physician may record the size of a person's hands but ignore their occupation, community status, or family history. Important social information can disappear even when the physical measurements improve. That does not mean the medical explanation was invented to hide a population. Disorders affecting growth are real and can be studied biologically. Their presence in documented individuals provides a direct explanation for many famous cases. The stronger question is whether the diagnosis was applied too broadly to people whose height may have had other causes. Genetic height can produce very tall families without disease. Nutrition, ancestry, and ordinary variation also matter. Not every 7-foot person has gigantism. If researchers assume that extreme height always represents illness, they may overlook patterns within families or communities. To establish that such a pattern was hidden, however, we would need records showing repeated misdiagnosis or evidence that tall populations were separated and reclassified deliberately. The theory usually relies on the general shift in language rather than documented cases of institutional instruction. Photography underwent its own transition during the same period. In the middle of the 19th century, photographs were relatively expensive and often carefully staged. Travelling performers, soldiers, officials, wealthy families and public figures were more likely to be photographed than ordinary labourers. By the early 20th century, cameras were becoming more accessible. Newspapers used photographs more frequently. Police and immigration services photographed individuals for identification. Families produced larger personal collections. At first glance, this should have created more images of unusually tall people, not fewer. The theory argues that later photography became less revealing because official captions controlled interpretation. Earlier images might show tall people without explanation. Later records identified them as performers, patients, or anomalies. The picture remained, but the possibility of a separate class was removed by the description placed beneath it. There is another explanation. As photography became common, unusual bodies represented a smaller proportion of the surviving record. A performer who once appeared in hundreds of commercial portraits was now surrounded by millions of photographs of ordinary people. The giants did not disappear. They became less dominant within a much larger visual archive. The entertainment industry also changed. Travelling exhibitions continued, but public taste shifted. Medical ethics developed slowly, and the display of people with unusual bodies became more controversial. Circuses remained popular, yet the language used to advertise performers changed. Some individuals entered film, vaudeville, sport, or promotional work rather than being presented only as physical curiosities. A decline in giant photographs may therefore reflect changes in entertainment and publishing, rather than the removal of a social class. The disappearance appears sharper online because digital collections are selective. Many well-known 19th century portraits have been scanned repeatedly. Early 20th century medical photographs may remain in restricted archives because they contain personal health information. Family albums may never have been digitized. Police or immigration images may be difficult to search. What looks like a historical absence can partly be a difference in modern access. Newspaper reports of giant skeletons changed during this period as well. Earlier papers frequently printed claims from farmers, builders, and amateur excavators. As archaeology became professionalized, discoveries were increasingly expected to include site records, measurements, and institutional review. This did not happen everywhere at once. Local newspapers continued publishing sensational claims, but museums and universities became less willing to accept them without physical evidence. The public story and the academic record began to separate. Supporters see that separation as the moment of suppression. Before professional control, the public heard regularly about giant remains. After professional control, the reports were dismissed as errors or hoaxes. The institutions that demanded the evidence were often the same institutions accused of losing it. This circular problem has kept the argument alive. A newspaper says the bones were sent to a museum. The museum says it has no verified giant skeleton. The missing object can be explained as proof that the museum concealed it, or as proof that the newspaper report was unreliable. Without accession records, shipping receipts, photographs, or surviving remains, neither side can reconstruct the full event. Museum reorganisation created many genuine losses. Collections grew quickly and were often stored poorly. Human remains could be separated from their original labels. Objects acquired by one department might be transferred to another. Staff members used different numbering systems. Private collections entered institutions with incomplete documentation. A skeleton described in an 1870 newspaper as belonging to a giant might arrive at a museum as several loose bones from a burial mound. Later staff could determine that the bones came from more than one individual. The dramatic claim would disappear from the catalogue because the specimen did not support it. To a future researcher searching for giant skeleton, the museum would appear to have erased the evidence. From the institution's perspective, it corrected a faulty identification. There were also more troubling practices. Museums destroyed objects that no longer fit their collecting priorities. Human remains were handled without consent. Scholars removed bones from indigenous graves and treated them as scientific material. Institutions concealed the origins of objects obtained through colonial violence. Given this history, complete trust would be naive. Museums have not always been transparent, and records have sometimes been altered to protect donors, collectors, or governments. The question is whether those documented failures support the specific claim that evidence of giants in Tartaria was targeted as a category. A coordinated removal would probably produce patterns in institutional correspondence. Curators would discuss how to classify oversized remains. Government departments would issue guidance. Collections from different regions would show similar disposal decisions. Private scholars might object. Newspapers might report disagreements. The absence of such records does not make coordination impossible, but it weakens the claim. It is easier to document widespread carelessness and bias than a deliberate international program focused on one hidden civilization. Map-making changed under similar pressures. By 1850, European empires had stronger military and administrative interests in northern and central Asia. Surveying became more precise. Russian expansion produced detailed maps of Siberia and Central Asia. British authorities studied routes near India. Qing territories were described through diplomacy, conflict, and trade. National borders became more important to governments that wanted to tax, police, and defend land. The broad label Tartary became less useful because officials required exact names. This process was not neutral. New maps served imperial power. They divided territories according to the priorities of governments rather than the identities of local communities. A place might receive a Russian, Chinese, English, or French name that ignored the term used by its inhabitants. Borders could turn seasonal routes and shared landscapes into controlled property. A disappearance from maps can therefore represent a real political loss, even when the missing label was not the name of a unified state. Supporters of the Tartaria theory are correct that maps do not merely describe the world. They help governments organise it. Changing a name can change how future generations understand a region. Once schools teach the new labels, the earlier term begins to look obsolete or mistaken. The disagreement concerns what was lost. Was it one advanced civilization, or was it a broad European category replaced by more specific imperial divisions? The map evidence supports a change in terminology and political control. It does not independently identify a common Tartarian administration, giant class, or technological system. Those connections have to come from other records. Architecture went through an equally dramatic transformation between 1850 and 1920. Cities expanded. Railway stations, post offices, courthouses, libraries, universities, exhibition halls, banks, and government buildings appeared in large numbers. Some were genuinely new. Others reused existing structures or were built on older foundations. Fires, wars, and redevelopment altered many urban centres. This was also the age of great exhibitions. Temporary structures were erected on a scale that still surprises modern viewers. Photographs show domes, towers, statues, fountains, and long avenues of elaborate facades. Many buildings were demolished after the events ended, sometimes within a few years. The destruction of these sites is often presented as part of the disappearance. If the architecture was inherited from Tartaria, World's Fairs offered governments a convenient way to present the buildings as temporary, use them briefly, and then remove them. The difficulty is that many exhibition sites have extensive construction records. Plans, contracts, progress photographs, engineering drawings, and eyewitness accounts document their creation. Temporary materials such as plaster, wood, and staff could produce a convincing stone appearance when photographed from a distance. The speed of construction was impressive, but temporary buildings did not require the same methods as permanent stone institutions. Their rapid demolition often occurred because the materials deteriorated or because the land was needed for other uses. Some structures survived, and their continued existence allows researchers to inspect how they were built. This makes a complete alternative origin less likely. Yet the broader observation remains valid. Enormous amounts of architecture vanished during this period. Cities demolished old neighbourhoods for boulevards, railways, factories, and commercial development. Wars destroyed buildings. Governments removed symbols of previous regimes. New owners altered interiors until the original use became difficult to recognise. A person living in 1920 could walk through a city that looked very different from the same place in 1850. Much of the built evidence of earlier life had disappeared, regardless of who created it. The theory groups these losses into one process. Conventional history usually explains them separately. One building was destroyed by fire, another was demolished for a road, a third collapsed after neglect, a fourth was removed after an exhibition, a fifth was damaged during war. Separate explanations can sound suspicious when repeated hundreds of times. How many fires, renovations, and demolitions can occur before a pattern should be considered? Quite a lot, unfortunately. 19th century cities burned frequently. Buildings contained timber, gas lighting, coal stoves, candles, crowded storage, and limited fire protection. Industrial districts added chemicals and machinery. A single fire could destroy several blocks. Urban growth also placed intense pressure on land. A government willing to preserve one monument might demolish an entire working-class district. Historic value was not always recognised, and preservation laws were weak. This does not mean every loss was innocent. Political authorities deliberately destroyed buildings associated with defeated groups. Religious sites were converted or dismantled. Archives vanished during revolutions. Statues and inscriptions were removed when regimes changed. The period included the revolutions of 1848, the American Civil War, imperial wars, colonial campaigns, the Franco-Prussian War, the Russian Revolution, and the First World War. These events displaced populations and destroyed records on a massive scale. Any theory of disappearance has to account for the fact that the world was already producing more than enough destruction without a secret project. Education may have been the most effective force in creating a standard historical memory. During the 19th century, governments expanded public schooling. Textbooks presented national stories with clear origins, heroes, borders, and institutions. Complex regional histories were simplified so that students could learn a common account. This process often excluded inconvenient groups. Indigenous histories were minimized. Colonial conquest was described as progress. Local identities were absorbed into national ones. Rulers used education to produce loyal citizens. If Tartaria had been a major civilization, standardized schooling would have provided a powerful way to remove it from public knowledge. Simply omit the name, credit the buildings to modern states, and teach later generations a different sequence. The problem is that Tartary was not completely omitted. It remained in historical maps, old encyclopedias, travel accounts, and academic discussions. The term became less common because scholars treated it as outdated and imprecise, not forbidden. A successful erasure normally tries to destroy or restrict the older evidence. In this case, large numbers of maps showing Tartary survive in public and private collections. Many have been digitized by major institutions. Historians openly explain how the term was used. Supporters respond that leaving the maps available was safe once the public had been taught to interpret them as a vague geography. The evidence could remain because its meaning had already been controlled. That possibility is difficult to disprove because it depends on motive rather than access. The same surviving map can be seen as proof of openness or proof that reinterpretation was more effective than destruction. The theory becomes strongest when it points to several changes occurring together, and weakest when it assumes that timing alone proves coordination. Between 1850 and 1920, words changed because disciplines changed. Maps changed because empires surveyed territory. Museum labels changed because classification systems developed. Giant reports declined because archaeology demanded better evidence. Architecture vanished because cities expanded and wars destroyed it. Photographs changed because cameras became common and entertainment markets shifted. These processes overlap naturally because they were all part of industrial modernization. A connected theory asks whether industrial modernization was itself the cover story for inheritance. Perhaps new governments did not create the infrastructure they claimed. Perhaps they occupied older systems, repaired them, and gradually replaced the evidence of previous builders. To examine that claim, construction records become essential. If railways, bridges, water systems, and public buildings were inherited, early documents should show engineers encountering technology they did not understand. Maintenance records might describe unknown materials or mechanisms. Officials might struggle to explain the origin of structures already in place. There are examples of later societies inheriting infrastructure from earlier ones. Roman roads, aqueducts, walls, and bridges were reused for centuries. Medieval buildings incorporated ancient stone. Colonial governments occupied indigenous and earlier imperial sites. Reuse is a normal part of history. What is missing is evidence that 19th-century states inherited a global industrial system from one advanced Tartarian civilization. Railways have documented stages of development. Locomotive designs changed visibly over time. Telegraph networks expanded along recorded routes. Factories evolved through identifiable patents and engineering practices. The systems were not perfect or mysterious to the people using them. Engineers argued about designs, recorded failures, and improved machinery. Their detailed technical literature is difficult to reconcile with the idea that they merely inherited finished infrastructure. Supporters may answer that the later stages were documented while the original foundations were hidden. Modern engineers could have adapted older systems and then written histories beginning with their own modifications. This would require identifying which components predate the official timelines. Material testing could help. Mortar, timber, metal alloys, and construction layers can often be dated or placed within technological periods. If large portions of a supposedly 19th century railway station were centuries older, physical analysis should reveal the difference. Some buildings do contain older sections, but this usually reflects known reuse rather than a hidden global origin. The disappearance theory also points to changes in population. Historical photographs sometimes show grand city centres with surprisingly few people. Streets appear empty. Buildings seem too large for the communities around them. This has led to claims that a major population loss occurred before new settlers arrived. Early photography again complicates the evidence. Long exposure times could cause moving people to disappear or become blurred. Photographers selected quiet hours to record architecture clearly. Streets might be cleared for official images. A single photograph cannot establish the usual population of a city. Census records, directories, tax lists, newspapers, and transport data provide stronger evidence. They often show rapid growth rather than mysterious emptiness. Newly constructed civic centres could appear underused because surrounding districts were still developing. Population losses did occur through disease, famine, forced removal, war, and colonial violence. In some regions, entire communities were destroyed or displaced. Those events deserve direct attention. Combining all of them into one global reset can erase the specific people who suffered and the governments responsible. The period was full of genuine concealment. Colonial authorities minimized massacres, states censored newspapers, museums hid the unlawful origins of collections, schools taught biased history, governments changed place names and removed political symbols. The question is not whether institutions can erase history. They can, and they have. The question is whether the evidence supports this particular erased history. By 1920, the world did look different. The term Tartaria had largely left common maps. Professional medicine had absorbed giants into clinical categories. Archaeology controlled the interpretation of ancient remains. National museums decided which objects represented the past. Public schools taught standard timelines. Many grand exhibition buildings were gone. Wars and revolutions had destroyed archives and monuments. A person trying to reconstruct an older story after that point would face real obstacles. Even without a conspiracy, the evidence had been filtered through institutions that did not preserve everything and did not treat every culture fairly. That may be the most defensible form of the disappearance argument. History was narrowed, simplified, and reorganized. Some evidence was lost, some was misclassified, some was removed for political reasons. Unusual people were reduced to medical cases or entertainment labels. Regional identities were placed beneath national histories. The leap comes when all of those losses are assigned to one hidden cause. The next task is to ask what remains after that leap is set aside. Even without a forgotten empire of giants, modern societies inherited buildings, roads, objects, stories, and institutions from people whose contributions were often minimized. Governments regularly claimed work they did not begin. Conquerors renamed places they did not create. Museums detached objects from the communities that made them. The world we recognize was inherited more often than it was built from nothing. Understanding who passed it down, who received the credit, and whose names were removed requires the same attention we have applied to the photographs, doors, maps, and bones. That brings us to the final set of questions about ownership, memory, and the way a later society can live inside the work of earlier people, while slowly forgetting who was there before. What then did later societies actually inherit? That question matters because inheritance is real, even when the larger theory is not proven. Governments occupy older buildings. New institutions take over roads, forts, ports, archives, and systems created by previous administrations. Conquerors rename cities. Revolutions replace symbols. Museums remove objects from their original settings and give them new labels. A structure can remain in the same place while the explanation attached to it changes several times. The disagreement is not about whether history is rewritten. It often is. The disagreement is about how much rewriting took place and what was removed. Supporters of the theory argue that modern nations inherited a large part of their architecture and infrastructure from an earlier civilization associated with Tartaria. They believe the tall people seen in old photographs belong to that older system, perhaps as guards, officials, engineers, or construction specialists. Once the transition was complete, later governments claimed the buildings, reassigned the objects, and explained the remaining individuals as circus performers or medical cases. The evidence examined so far does not establish that complete account. Old maps show that Tartary was a genuine historical term, but they do not show one unified technological empire. Photographs prove that exceptionally tall people lived and worked within 19th century society, but they do not identify a shared administrative class. Large buildings and objects exist, but most can be explained through ceremony, industry, crowd movement, mechanical use, architectural fashion, or accommodation for individual tall people. Newspaper reports of giant skeletons remain interesting, yet most lack surviving remains, reliable excavation records, or measurements that can be checked. The period between 1850 and 1920 saw enormous changes in classification, education, medicine, mapping, and urban development. But timing alone does not demonstrate one organised removal. That may sound as though the mystery disappears once each object receives an ordinary explanation. It does not. The more realistic history is still full of inheritance, misattribution, destruction, and forgotten people. It is simply less tidy than the theory. Consider a government building that changes hands after a revolution. The new administration may keep the offices, replace the flags, remove portraits, rename the halls, and publish a new history of the site. 30 years later, most visitors associate the building only with the current state. The earlier occupants become a sentence on a plaque, assuming the plaque is feeling generous. That is a genuine transfer of memory. The same thing happens after conquest. A new authority may adopt roads, irrigation systems, warehouses, ports, and fortifications created by the people it defeated. Official documents then describe improvements made under the new government, while paying less attention to the system already in place. Sometimes the later administration genuinely modernizes what it inherits. It adds rail lines, replaces wooden bridges, expands water systems, and repairs damaged walls. Over time, the distinction between original construction and later modification becomes blurred. The government that performed the latest upgrade may receive credit for the entire structure. This does not require a secret agreement. It is a common habit of power. People prefer to describe themselves as founders rather than tenants. Buildings are especially vulnerable to this kind of simplified history because they rarely belong to only one moment. A cathedral may stand on an earlier religious site. A palace may contain walls from a fortress. A railway station may reuse a warehouse foundation. A courthouse may occupy a former government residence. Each rebuilding adds material while removing evidence of the previous arrangement. When a guidebook gives one construction date, it may be referring only to the visible facade, the current use, or the most recent major reconstruction. A visitor who later discovers older masonry beneath the building may feel deceived. Sometimes the guidebook is incomplete rather than intentionally false. That distinction matters, but it does not make the omission unimportant. The same problem affects ownership of engineering achievements. Large projects are usually credited to architects, rulers, investors, or institutions. The labourers who cut stone, moved timber, fired bricks, dug foundations and assembled ironwork are less likely to be named. Thousands of people can disappear behind one architect's name. If the workers were migrants, prisoners, enslaved people, indigenous communities, or members of a politically marginal group, their role may be reduced even further. The building remains, but the people who physically created it become invisible. This form of erasure is well documented. It does not depend on hidden giants, but it may help explain why the theory feels believable. We are often shown magnificent structures without being told enough about the workforce, supply networks, technical methods, or human cost. The official story can sound suspiciously easy. A plaque might state that a large building was completed in 4 years. It does not mention the quarry operating day and night, the temporary railway moving stone, the hundreds of workers living nearby, or the accidents that occurred during construction. Without those details, the achievement appears impossible. The missing explanation creates room for an inherited civilization theory. A similar gap appears in photographs of cities. A monumental building stands beside dirt roads and simple houses. The people nearby wear worn clothing. The contrast suggests that they could not have created the structure. That conclusion depends on an assumption that societies develop evenly. They do not. A government can spend heavily on a palace while neighbourhoods lack drainage. A city can complete a railway station before paving nearby streets. A wealthy institution can import skilled craftsmen, while most residents remain poor. Monumental architecture often reflects concentrated money and authority rather than general prosperity. The people in the muddy street may have built the stone building, even if they never benefited from it. There is an uncomfortable lesson in that possibility. Earlier societies did not need to be more advanced in every way to create impressive architecture. They only needed organised labour, technical knowledge, materials, and someone powerful enough to direct the resources. This brings us back to the unusually tall people in old photographs. Even without evidence of a hidden class, their historical treatment deserves more attention. Many were socially integrated. They served in armies, worked in courts, appeared beside officials, travelled internationally, married, ran businesses and supported families. Some chose public exhibition because it provided an income unavailable elsewhere. Others were placed on display by promoters who controlled the way their bodies were described. Later accounts often reduce these individuals to height measurements and medical conditions. Their names may survive, but their personal histories receive much less space. A man becomes the 8-foot giant. A woman becomes the tallest lady in Europe. The body replaces the person. That is another kind of erasure. Medical diagnosis can explain growth without explaining a life. A pituitary condition may account for a person's height, but it does not tell us how they were treated, what work they performed, or whether their size gave them authority in a particular setting. The theory may exaggerate the number and political role of unusually tall people, but it points toward a real historical question. Were some of them selected for specialised positions because of their appearance and strength? The answer is almost certainly yes in particular cases. Ceremonial guards were chosen partly for height. Travelling shows built careers around physical scale. Rulers valued imposing attendance. Employers may have assigned tall workers to tasks that benefited from reach or public visibility. What has not been demonstrated is that these individuals belong to one connected system, extending from Tartaria across Europe, Asia and the Americas. That difference should remain clear. The furniture and tools tell a similar story. Some oversized objects belong to unusually large individuals. Others served groups, machines, ceremonies, institutions or advertisements. A large chair may have been practical, symbolic, or both. A long-handled tool may have allowed an ordinary worker to apply greater force. A heavy hammer may once have hung from a mechanical frame. The objects become misleading when they are separated from their use. This is common in museums. An object is removed from a workshop and placed behind glass. Its supporting machine is gone. The person who operated it is unnamed. The label contains 2 sentences. Visitors see an enormous iron tool and are expected to understand a vanished industry before reaching the gift shop. When no clear explanation is provided, people create one. Museums could reduce this uncertainty by showing complete contexts, original photographs, measurements, and catalogue histories. Some already do. Others lack the money, staff, or records required. A surprising amount of historical mystery begins with poor labelling and a storage system that seemed sensible to someone in 1912. Institutional failure should not be confused automatically with conspiracy, but neither should it be excused. When museums lose provenance, they lose part of the history they were created to preserve. Human remains require even greater care. Many collections were assembled through grave robbery, colonial violence, and unequal power. Bones were taken from communities, measured, classified, and stored without consent. Labels reflected racial theories that were later rejected, but the remains stayed in drawers and cabinets for generations. When institutions now restrict access or return those remains, researchers interested in giant claims may see concealment. Descendant communities may see long-delayed respect. Both concerns cannot be resolved by treating the dead as props in an argument. A responsible investigation would begin with consent, documentation, and qualified analysis. If a skeleton is claimed to be unusually tall, the measurements should be made transparently. The individual's cultural context should remain central. A real person should not be turned into evidence for a civilization simply because a newspaper used the word giant. At the same time, institutions should explain what happened to remains mentioned in old records whenever that information exists. Silence encourages suspicion. A clear account stating that a specimen was remeasured, transferred, repatriated, identified as animal, or lost in a documented fire is more useful than a general denial. History becomes stronger when records can be checked. The Tartary maps should be treated the same way. They're genuine and worth examining. They show how European map makers understood, or failed to understand, enormous parts of Eurasia. Their changing labels reveal growing imperial control, improved surveying, and shifting political language. They also remind us that the names on maps are not neutral. A mapmaker chooses which borders to draw, which people to name, and which areas to group together. Later governments may replace local names with administrative ones. Schools then teach the new map until the earlier version feels strange. The disappearance of Tartary from common use was not the disappearance of an empty word. It reflected the division of real lands inhabited by real communities. Russian expansion, Qing rule, the decline of Khanates, colonial competition and modern border formation changed how the region was represented. Many local histories received less attention than the histories of the empires that absorbed them. That is a significant loss, even if Tartaria was not a unified global civilization. The desire to recover forgotten history is therefore understandable. The danger comes when recovery begins by replacing many overlooked societies with one imagined empire. Siberian peoples, Mongol communities, Central Asian Khanates, Turkic groups, Manchu history, and numerous local cultures should not disappear beneath the label Tartaria a second time. A theory intended to restore the past can accidentally flatten it. The same warning applies to indigenous history in the Americas. 19th-century giant stories were often connected to claims that native peoples could not have built mounds or complex settlements. A mysterious vanished race was credited with the work instead. That interpretation did not honour forgotten builders. It removed the achievements of living communities and assigned them to someone considered more acceptable by settlers. Modern giant theories sometimes repeat part of that pattern without intending to. Monumental earthworks, engineered landscapes, and sophisticated urban systems are treated as evidence of an unknown civilization because the recognised builders are assumed to have lacked the ability. A careful investigation should begin by taking historical peoples seriously. Large projects do not become impossible merely because the builders did not use modern machines or organise themselves like modern states. The labour and intelligence required were real, whether or not every individual name survives. This does not mean official history should be accepted without challenge. Dates can be wrong. Institutions protect reputations. Archaeologists can misinterpret evidence. Governments promote national myths. Experts sometimes dismiss unusual claims before examining them properly. Skepticism should work in both directions. A museum label deserves questions. So does a caption added to an online photograph by an unknown account. A school textbook may simplify history. So may a video that places unrelated images beside one another and treats visual similarity as proof. The standard should be the same for every explanation. Where did the evidence come from? Can the object be measured? Is the earliest record available? Does the proposed date match the material? Are there independent sources? What evidence would show that the theory is wrong? That final question is especially useful. If every missing object proves removal, and every surviving object proves Tartaria, the claim cannot be tested. If every expert disagreement proves concealment and every expert agreement proves coordination, the result has been decided before the investigation begins. A strong historical theory must risk being mistaken. The world inherited by modern societies was not built by one people at one time. It was assembled through layers. Roads followed older paths. Cities grew around earlier settlements. Buildings reused foundations. Machines developed through repeated experiments. Empires adopted the systems of those they conquered. New states renamed what they received. Some contributors were celebrated. Others were ignored. Some records survived in archives. Others disappeared through fire, war, censorship, neglect, private sale, and decay. That complicated inheritance may not offer the clean answer promised by a lost civilization theory, but it explains why so many traces seem disconnected. They were created by different people for different purposes, then collected later under categories that did not preserve every original meaning. A giant chair in one museum may have advertised a furniture company. A large coat in another may have belonged to a known performer. A tall door may have admitted carriages. A buried window may reflect a raised street. A newspaper skeleton may have been measured badly. A map marked Tartaria may describe a region rather than a state. Another chair, coat, doorway, burial, or map may still contain an unresolved question. The ordinary explanations do not have to fit every case. The responsible conclusion is not that every mystery has been solved. It is that the cases should remain separate until evidence connects them. There may be forgotten tall individuals whose lives have not been properly researched. Museum collections may contain misidentified remains. Buildings may have older foundations than their public histories acknowledge. Local traditions may preserve details absent from national records. Archives may still hold letters, plans, photographs, and catalogues capable of changing particular stories. Those possibilities justify further investigation. They do not yet establish an erased civilization of giants. Perhaps the most valuable part of this subject is not the final claim, but the habits it encourages when approached carefully. Look beyond a caption. Compare different editions of a map. Measure the functional parts of an object rather than its decoration. Ask who created the museum label. Check whether several newspaper stories came from one original report. Find out what a building stood on before the current facade was added. History often changes when someone notices that a familiar explanation was based on an assumption. It also goes badly when an exciting assumption is protected from every challenge. So where does that leave the world supposedly inherited from Tartaria? It leaves us with a real region hidden beneath an outdated European name, a collection of states and peoples whose histories deserve more attention. It leaves us with genuine examples of conquest, renaming, institutional control, and cultural loss. It leaves us with exceptionally tall humans whose lives were often reduced to public spectacle. It leaves us with buildings that changed owners and functions, objects that lost their provenance, and human remains handled by institutions that did not always behave responsibly. It also leaves us without the direct evidence needed to join all of those facts into one forgotten empire. That answer may feel less satisfying than a complete revelation. It requires us to hold several possibilities at once. Institutions can mislead without hiding this specific civilization. History can be incomplete without being entirely fabricated. A photograph can be authentic, while its modern caption is false. An object can remain unexplained without proving the most dramatic theory available. There is no need to ridicule the questions. Large doors do look strange. Old maps do contain unfamiliar names. Newspaper archives do report astonishing discoveries. Museums do lose objects. Governments do rewrite history. The questions become useful when they lead to closer examination rather than automatic belief. As you look at the old photographs, the great halls, the tools, the maps, and the reports from beneath the ground, it may help to ask one final personal question. Is there a building, object, or local story near you whose official explanation has never seemed complete? Perhaps there is an old station with blocked windows, a courthouse built over earlier foundations, a family photograph containing an unidentified tall figure, or a museum object with a label that says little more than "Purpose Unknown." Those details are worth preserving. Context can disappear surprisingly quickly once the people who remember it are gone. If this investigation has given you something interesting to consider, you can like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys looking carefully at the parts of history that do not fit neatly into one sentence. The evidence does not support every claim made about Tartaria or a hidden class of giants. It does support something quieter and easier to overlook. Later societies inherit far more than they admit. Official histories leave people out, and objects lose their meaning when they are separated from the lives around them. The work is not to replace one simple account with another. It is to recover names, measurements, records, and context wherever they still survive. That is usually where forgotten history is found. Not behind one final secret door, but inside archives, foundations, family collections, museum catalogues, and ordinary documents that were waiting for someone to read them carefully.